My name is Jeremy Cohen. I'm a graduate student in sociology here at NYU, and I'm happy to welcome you here to the panel tonight on what is the Occupy movement, or the roundtable. This is one in a general series. We had one about a month ago at NYU in the same building, and there's one happened in Chicago, I believe on Tuesday, and one is happening in Boston next week. There's been one in Halifax in Canada, so part of a longer series, and video, audio for those who are online. Just quickly, other things. This is sponsored by the Platypus Affiliated Society. Really briefly, we're a student organization, nationwide student organization that hosts panels like this, as well as reading groups and informal conversations about left politics yesterday, today, and tomorrow. There's a number of materials up there. We publish a monthly paper, which is free, has an interview. The most recent edition is an interview with Slavoj Žižek, in part about Occupy and Marxism. And there's other materials about our regular activities. And a list host will go, a sign-up sheet for our list will go around for future events. Other sort of practical thing is that, unfortunately, David Graeber is not going to be with us. At about 2 a.m., we received an email that he was overcommitted and wanted to spend the weekend with his girlfriend. So that is what I can say. Unfortunately, he won't be here, and we're all quite sorry about that. But there is free food in the back. That's the final announcement, and I will proceed. Okay, so the way the roundtable is going to run is I have a couple of really brief opening remarks that I prepared. Then we're going to open it up for about an hour. I'm going to pose some of the questions which are in your program also, if you got a program, that we sent to the panelists. We're going to have kind of an open discussion around these questions. And then after an hour, which I'm going to try to time really strictly, we're going to have another hour of Q&A from the audience, plenty of time for mutual discussion. And I think that's it as to practicalities. Okay, so though in question, it seems that Occupy is here to stay. Mayors and police in cities across the US have arranged coordinated, thuggish crackdowns on the protest encampments. But Occupy took the Port of Oakland on November 2nd. Occupy brought out tens of thousands to New York streets on November 17th and staged events across the country. Students occupied the New School shortly thereafter. This last Tuesday, December 6th, a homeless family occupied a foreclosed home with Occupy Our Homes as the slogan. Farther ahead, the Republican and Democratic national conventions are coming in 2012. Some expect 2012 will mimic 1968 and its tumultuous protests aimed at the conservatism of both parties. There has been some commentary about a potential phase 2 of these protests, as, ironically, the name Occupy no longer quite fits. OWS, though its roots run much deeper, is, I think, a little like the Obama phenomenon. Its capacious symbolism, we are the 99%, occupying public space, allows all sorts to project onto it their own social and political desires, problems, and fantasies. This has the temporary advantage of allowing OWS to strike a deeper chord in the popular consciousness than left drawling has for quite a while. It has also meant that everyone from anarchists to left liberals to festival hoppers to Ron Paul supporters can exist in some kind of tenuous camaraderie. But the transition to phase 2 means the need to face squarely ideological differences and priorities. When challenges arise, what tactics and strategies will be pursued? How is the movement going to interact with the coming bonanza of electoral politics? What are the international implications of this movement when more democratic Europe faces draconian austerity in the face of continuing capitalist crisis? One can protest that anyone can be a part of the movement, but key divides over ultimate goals, resistance, reform, or revolution, a kinder capitalism, or something else altogether, will not disappear by wishing it were so. Columbia professor Dorian Warren, at a recent panel on OWS, when I asked him about Occupy and its anti-capitalism, admitted that the techniques for discussing differences within the movement are still not very developed. In the hopes of channeling popular rage and escaping old political ideas that are no more than deadening cliches, Occupy has gambled that a feeling of openness, even vagueness, is necessary for rousing a new movement to action. But if this moment is to become critical for future developments, more than some burst of youthful exuberance we will later recall as embittered cynics who have seen things get much worse since, then the meaning of the present must be debated, The ideas must be clarified, the intellectual resources created just as much as the practical ones. For by not forming and honing our ideas, we risk much. We risk imbibing the bad ideas of ages past. We risk finding ourselves flummoxed in the face of new obstacles and developments. We risk scattering our force and losing our time. We risk missing the opportunities of the epoch. This is why Platypus has been hosting these roundtables in cities across North America, to foster conversations devoted to ruthlessly critical ideological reflection and contestation. We unabashedly emphasize the importance of considering and transforming political ideas in light of the continuing problems and potentials capitalism poses. We seek not the authoritative answer to the questions of our political moment, but that these questions be openly argued so that some light results. And so that's my introduction. I am going to start by posing some questions to these panelists. First of all, so you know who they are, Brian Dominic has nearly 20 years of experience as an activist, organizer, and journalist. In his writing and lecturing, he is largely focused on questions of strategy and tactics for far-reaching social change. Forming and consulting alternative institutions has been a specialty of Brian's, from affinity groups to worker co-ops to 501c3s to international activism networks. He's a former co-founder of New Standard News and instructor at the Z Media Institute. Hannah Oppel earned her PhD in the Department of Anthropology at Stanford University, with research interests in the daily life of capitalism and the private sector in Africa in particular. Hannah's work draws on critical development studies, economic anthropology, and political economy. Her current project, Futures, is based on 14 months of ethnographic fieldwork in the transnational oil and gas industry in Equatorial Guinea. Eric Van Deventer is a doctoral student at NYU in the Department of Sociology, presently working on the political economy of finance. He's been active at OWS and in the Demands Working Group. And finally, last but not least, Nathan Schneider is an editor for Waging Nonviolence. He writes, who thankfully helped co-sponsor this panel, I should mention. He writes about religion, reason, and violence for publications, including The Nation, The New York Times, The Boston Globe, The American Prospect, and others. He's also an editor at Killing the Buddha. So, we're going to first start with the kind of question I kind of alluded to, I think, in my opening comments about the phase two. Insofar as Occupy is no longer in Zuccotti Park primarily, and cities across the country, people have been getting evicted. Is this a new moment? Is there a new possibilities and new challenges that the Occupy movement has faced? What directions is it going in? What directions do you think it ought to go in? And the floor is open to you guys.
I'm happy to start. So I think, tell me your name again. Jeremy. I think the first thing that I'm going to do in the spirit of having open conversations and open disagreement is disagree openly with some of what you said in your opening statements, which, first of all, this idea that the sort of, what Jeremy called the capacious symbolism of Occupy, which has enabled anarchists, Marxists, liberals all to come together, that this is only a temporary strength and it will be eclipsed by a need for a narrowing of ideology. I'm just going to say I disagree with that, period. So I'll start with that, and I'm happy to elaborate on that as we go forward, but we'll get there, I'm sure. So I think that Liberty Square, and I'm drawing on David here. I should also say, somebody drew that biography of me from a website somewhere. I'm active in the Occupy movement right now. I've been working with the think tank working group at Occupy, and so I would say a lot of my current project is actually that right now.
You also helped co-sponsor us, so.
But I'm drawing on David Graeber here a little bit and what I want to say to this question, which is that Liberty Square was fundamentally a space of experiment, right? So Graeber and others have referred to this kind of experimentation as prefigurative politics. So what does it mean to make something new in the shell of the old? What does it mean to provide free school? What does it mean to provide free food? What does it mean to provide free education, et cetera? That experience, for those of us who were there, was incredible and also incredibly arduous. I would say I don't want to idealize it by any stretch of the imagination. So the first thing about phase two is not to idealize phase one. And then the second question about phase two, I think, is obviously what do post-park spaces of experiment look like? And I think Jeremy actually listed a lot of them. The foreclosure defense on the 6th of this week was an amazing experience. I hope that many of you were there. Not only did Occupy, in conjunction with different community organizations, put a formerly homeless family in a Bank of America home, and are they still there with legal defense and with a generator, et cetera? But it was not a symbolic gesture. The rhetoric that entire day was, this is the beginning. We are going to put people back in their foreclosed homes in conjunction with community organizations, wherever they may be. I think that that's thrilling. The atrium of 60 Wall Street, which is a Wall Street building, right, where bankers work, where traders work, is completely occupied. I showed up for a meeting last night at 7 o'clock. There were probably 400 people in that atrium, all broken out into little groups, doing amazing work. So the first thing is that Occupy, narrowly conceived as the occupation of space, is not over in phase 2. But then obviously we also want to think about prefigurative politics not as they're related to space narrowly, but also as they're related to I guess what you would call the imagination. Graeber also calls it the imagination. So how do we begin in phase 2 to think about the intersection of capitalism and racism? What would popular control of the financial system look like? What does it mean if personhood is less mediated by credit scores? How do we democratize economic analysis? I mean, I think all of these questions that have been posed from the beginning of Occupy Wall Street come to the fore in phase 2 because we are forced to stop figuring out how to feed ourselves and start figuring out how to answer some of these questions like the foreclosure movement action did and will continue to do.
So I would go in the opposite direction. I would say that what needs to come out of this is an independent movement of the working class in this country. I don't know what specific relevance occupations will have in the future of that. I think the foreclosure occupations are not really occupations, they're returns of people's homes to them. And I think that's very important. And I think that is exactly the kind of economically significant intervention that this movement can make. But I think occupations of squares don't necessarily have the character of an attack on economic reproduction in the society. They're highly symbolic. And they have drawn a lot of people to a social movement in this year, but I think there was a very good chance that in whatever form, there would be a social movement of this scale in this year, and I don't think that occupations as such should be regarded as a distinctive or a necessary characteristic of any future action. What I do think is that the movement needs to develop more clarity in terms of its politics. It needs to sharpen the ideas that people have, and it needs to understand what the contradictions between different viewpoints are. And for that, I think there needs to be more open discussion and intervention of various political orientations, which I think we can talk more about. And
I'd just like to interject, in any discussion about what the movement needs to do, I think we have to take into account the nature of the movement and the way in which the experimentation that Hannah was talking about is really built into the structure of it. There's nobody who can decide the direction that the movement is going to go in, except the people who participate in it and engage in it, and who put themselves out. And I think often really make themselves available to have their own minds changed. And that's an experience I've seen over and over and over again happening through the planning process of this movement, where it went from the kind of Adbusters model of a single occupation of a single space to a movement that was built around assemblies, and then once the occupation got started, as people started changing their ideas through the process of what they were wanting and getting out of this experience. So I think the role of self-transformation and of conversation is really important when we talk about what we think the movement should do next. I mean, we have to kind of subject ourselves to that experience.
Do you think there's more of that happening in sort of phase 2, or that's going to look different?
Well, I think it's a little bit more of a challenge in a way, because phase 2, as Hannah pointed out, is structured a bit more around existing organizations. It looks like it doesn't have that kind of single space of Zuccotti Park or Liberty Plaza or Square or Park or whatever. So I think it's going to be a lot more people working in a lot of different places and making sure that they're having these kinds of direct democracy experiences, might be harder. And I really don't know where that's going to go. I don't know what the shape is going to be. I mean, as a reporter trying to cover this movement since the planning process, the number one thing I've experienced is surprise. I mean, I'm constantly being reprimanded by the movement itself and against my expectations for it. And so that's partly why I say what I said before. Finally, just in terms of the park itself, one thing that really struck me was that after the park was cleared, a lot of people were saying we have to get the park back. We're nothing without the park, and those were mainly people who had come after it started, because those of us who were there on the first night remember that there was this intense debate about whether occupying the park constituted occupying Wall Street, and how this was a completely inadequate compromise with power, and that we had to be on Wall Street, damn it, and nothing else would qualify. And so again, I think this is another example of how our sense of what the movement should look like going into it often changes in the course of our experience with it.
I'm only going to respond to this question to the extent that I'm going to say that, so it's not conspicuous that I'm not responding. I don't consider myself centrally involved in Occupy per se. So on questions of where it is and where it's going or where it should go particularly, I'm not going to say very much. I just don't think that it's the place of someone who isn't participating to do that. I was invited, I think, more to provide movement context, having kind of a broader perspective and a slightly more objective, meaning from the outside looking in type perspective. So I don't...
Do you want to expand on that then? I mean, because the second question we posed to the panelists was in terms of historical precedents, one, and reflecting on them for the future of the Occupy movement, one sort of clear precedent is Seattle 99 that has a lot of similarities, support generally by organized labor, has a lot of anarchist influence, is at the end of the Democratic administration, is posed as against neoliberalism. So, and I know you have a history in that. So what do you think that the predecessor means for the present, how the transformations and failures of the anti or alter globalization movement, how do you think those play out in assessing sort of where Occupy is, where it might go, etc.?
Okay, then we'll move on to question 2.
You gave me a segue.
Yeah, perfect. I think that what's one of the things that's key to realize here is that the similarities are quite profound, but the differences are where the advantages are. The differences, I'm going to start by explaining a talk that I gave, or the very end of a talk that I gave, probably just before 9/11. That was a major talk, probably my biggest, addressing the global justice or anti-globalization movement. It was a really big deal that in September we were going to have our umpteenth and largest of the summit hopping events, these major events that happened around the World Trade Organization, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and the IMF and World Bank. And this was going to be the annual IMF World Bank meeting, I believe, if I remember correctly. It was going to happen in late September 2001. And so I gave this talk saying, how about after this one, we all go into our communities and we create these manifestations that we do for 4 or 5 days whenever we have a big summit, which was that, for those of you who don't know, activists from all over the country and really all over the world, and this happened in other countries as well, where people would fly in, drive in, bus in, hop trains in, and they would go and they would create something not that dissimilar to what you'd see on Occupy Wall Street down at Zuccotti Park for a few days. And it would be spokes council meetings and affinity groups getting together and people talking about direct democracy, mostly just talking about how to shut down a meeting or how to affect a meeting, how to get a message out, that kind of stuff. But it was really similar stuff using very similar methods, consensus, open democracy, all this kind of thing was going on. And what happened was we were all starting to get really wary of it, and we said, we have to take this stuff home and do this in our communities. So what happened on about day 3 of Occupy Wall Street was picking up exactly where a lot of us were thinking that needed to go. So the most amazing thing for me that I have to say up front about Occupy as a movement or as a phenomenon has been that I think without being preconceived as needing to do exactly what about at least a third of us were very strongly saying needed to be the next phase of the anti-globalization movement, which was bring anti-capitalist organizing not just to the globe but to the community, started right away, and people started forming these directly democratic manifestations on the ground in communities all over the country and all over the world, and this is it. So I think in a way there's perfect context, there's a perfect continuity there. The difference is that movement was formed almost entirely until the last year or so, when a lot of people started coming in, by people with years and years of experience of the frustration of what it's like to try to get anybody to come out and do anything. And so now we see a movement where almost without, with very minimal work in terms of understanding where it was going to be heading, taking off and expanding in ways that I don't think anyone really could have believed in their wildest imagination. So the other thing that I want to say about the difference is that as we were hopping from summit to summit, 11 years ago now, or up to 11 years ago now, we were building momentum and we were building skills, and we had a lot of time in between. And I think a lot of us took really good advantage of that, and a lot of people didn't. A lot of people had too much downtime and sort of fell out of practice of things and didn't really see the skills and the energy that they were using at these summits and these big events as having any particular relevance at home. So that was what we were trying to encourage people to do, was continue this stuff in the downtimes, and maybe or maybe not even show up at the summits, but start doing this organizing on the ground. And so now that we see that happening, I think there's a sense of urgency that's very similar to the sense of urgency that we would have at these summits, because we literally had a target and a finite period of time in which to do our activism. And my advice as someone with a lot of experience in organizing is to slow down or maintain the slowness that I do see when I look at folks who are doing the best work inside the Occupy actions and the organizing. They are taking their time. They're saying it's good to have conversation. We're not hurrying to find demands. We're not hurrying to define ourselves. And I don't think there's any better move than that. Take your time. It's not so urgent that the world is going to collapse in a month if Occupy doesn't save it. Occupy is almost certainly going to go through numerous transformations and may not, as was already mentioned, may not be called Occupy in 2 months, may take all these other forms that we kind of hope that it will. And there was a rush for a few days, I know, when Zuccotti stopped being, the safe home that people considered it. But look at what's evolved. Look what's already been described. That people are finding new ways to manifest this and new ways to take that time. And I would say that taking the time to define the movement very slowly, to define itself in context of a larger movement maybe, or maybe to define it as a movement in and of itself, whatever needs to happen, that time is available and should be taken, and that the participatory open structures that already exist are some of those that will lend themselves well to this.
I think the connection to the global justice movement or anti-globalization movement is really, really important here. And I think it's something that a lot of people in the United States really haven't grasped, certainly not the US media. I mean, I was shocked on October 15th, the Global Day of Action. Even Democracy Now! Called it an extension of the Occupy movement. That Day of Action was being planned by the Spanish May 15th movement since May. And people from that Spanish movement were on the ground from before September 17th with Occupy Wall Street, and have continued to be in communication. And this idea of doing foreclosure actions is something that the Spanish movement also did very quickly. I was in Greece last month with an organizer with Occupy Wall Street and people from the assemblies in Athens, and they were addressing a lot of the same problems and doing it in a lot of the same ways, taking public space and going from there. So I think it's really important that even though our media doesn't know enough about the rest of the world to realize that this is part of a global movement, it's important that as many of us as possible do.
So I also think there's a lot of continuity with sort of WTO council protests, but I see this as sort of an idea that you can focus on a much reviled part of the world economy that is symbolic of a lot of things, and register your discontent in sort of as broad a group as possible, and that is a way to affect social change. Fundamentally a protest strategy. I don't think this is the case. I think in order to change things, which ought to be our objective, we need to work through actual means of leveraging structural power in the society, which fundamentally comes down to class powers, and we should be looking to the working class. These kinds of symbolic gestures are, they can help people to have an opportunity to discuss. They can have mass meetings. They can help people to politically develop. They can allow people to have conversations. There can be communication.
Cell phones.
Communication of different ideas. These are all very important, as are protests in general. But as a strategy to try to prefigure a democracy through the kinds of structures that you're able to set up voluntarily in a park is not a way to the future. This is not the kind of society that you can set up in a park is not a society that I would like to see in the future. I do not want to participate in meetings for hours on end necessarily, unless there's something important being settled. And I think a lot of people don't have time to do this kind of thing, so it becomes a self-selecting community. And there needs to be a way that the movement can allow people to participate who are not committed in that way, or who don't have the capability to be committed in that way. And I think that is a way in which the movement needs to change.
Did someone want to come in and respond, or about Seattle panel?
I don't have anything to say about Seattle.
I pretty much agree with all of that. I don't think there's even, they're not mutually exclusive ideas. I think that I had a lot of criticisms of the talk that I was just referring to that I gave in 2001 included most of those ideas that, that the summit, we raise awareness through protest. We rarely pose a real threat to powers that make them change until we really do the kinds of, except in cases where we do real direct action to shut down and disrupt their meetings, like did happen. So that did have a good effect, but it didn't, even though we were spending a few days organizing democratically, similar to ways that it has gone on at the Occupy encampments and since. I don't think that any of us believe that that was the future society, or that even prefigured a future society. Though that concept of prefiguring has a couple of different manifestations. One is the idea that it's sort of conceptual, and I think what Hannah's saying is that as we're organizing of any kind, we want to be doing it in the sort of the same method that we'd want to see happen in a future society. The idea isn't necessarily that that's going to yield immediately to a future society. The kinds of prefigurative organizing that we can do that might yield to a future society are those going back into our communities and forming alternative institutions, taking control of existing institutions, and serving the needs of people. So the best approach is to take that idea of democracy and participation, bring it to communities where we already live, not other people's communities so much necessarily, but places that we understand, that we can participate democratically, and that we can start providing for needs that are local, that are actual, and that are real. And this is the kind of thing that wins allegiance. And I use that word, I know it's a weird word, but I think it's sympathy, it's participation, it's interest, it's involvement, it's all that kind of stuff. It's the idea that, hey, this movement is something that I actually want to be involved in. And the farther we take that from somebody, and we used to take it very far, we'd go to the fortified barricades of some giant summit of a bunch of elites. And now it's still being taken to sort of central parks, but out of neighborhoods for the most part, and most of the occupies out of actual neighborhoods. And now it's starting to bleed back into those neighborhoods and returning home. And we'll see what happens when people are actually fulfilling the real needs of real people that aren't just in some space like a park that you have to go to and you have to have the time and privilege to do it, but actually taking it to places where it gives people time and privilege by saying, well, those things that you used to do. I mean, when I see occupiers getting involved in doing laundries and getting involved in, helping to feed people in communities and feeding themselves and doing that in the neighborhoods, that will be a sign that there's maybe that's phase 2, maybe that's phase 3, I'm not sure, but that's a big step. And that's the kind of thing that people are going to say, hey, these Occupy people, they're not just in some park, they're here. So we'll see.
I think I do have one thing to say that I think addresses some of what several people have said. So we're at week 13 of the Occupy movement right now. If I or any other Occupy participant had said to any of us in this room, by week 13, and this actually, what I'm about to talk about actually happened in week 12. So by week 12, what we want is for the most important Republican strategists, the most highly paid strategists, to tell all Republicans that capitalism is a bad word. And that's all we want by week 12. We don't want to put people back in foreclosed home. We don't, none of that. All we want is for capitalism not only as a word and a concept to come back onto the national stage, but to be a bad word and to be terrifying for a certain political sector. I think actually even arguably the most hardline Marxists among us might say, yeah, for 12 weeks, that's actually not bad to put the idea, the history of capitalism back into the national conversation. That is not something that we could have anticipated at week 1. So this goes back a little bit to what Nathan was saying, is that all of us, by actually participating in the process, have been radically transformed by it. And I would invite those of us who feel we have very specific visions for transformation that target specific, whether they're class interests or specific ideological forms of opening or foreclosure, to come and participate. I mean, I'm looking directly at Ross, who is an erudite and encyclopedic Marxist who was in our think tank, you know, most days, 3 or 4 days out of 7, however many we were doing them for many of the first weeks. And I think, I mean, I would love to hear Ross maybe in the Q&A talk about how his particular orientation toward what I would call a body of theory and a body of history was impacted by bringing it into a super open, very diverse set of conversations with a bunch of people who either know what capitalism is or don't, or know who Marx is or don't, or know what the class struggle is or don't, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, I guess I just think that I am not somebody who fetishizes process, and I know I'm not looking at you. You did not do that either. There are some people, I think, who fetishize process. David Graeber actually has often been critiqued for that. I'm not somebody who fetishizes process, but as an anthropologist, as somebody who pays attention to what happens in our daily lives on the ground, how things actually get done, how theories actually get mobilized historically, I mean, I think process has a lot to tell us, and capitalism becoming a bad word is not something we could have ever anticipated. In fact, I think it blows away all of our wildest dreams, so I'm happy with that, and I think Marxists should be too.
So, I mean, you've given me the perfect segue. Is Occupy anti-capitalist? I do remember the Economist, the magazine, called Occupy anti-capitalist, and there were several letters to the editor the next week from people in Occupy who were like, no, we're not anti-capitalist. Like, we're open to everybody. It's no, we're not anti-capitalist. So there's that sentiment. But on the other hand, there are obviously, including at this table, a lot of very radical people involved in it. So is Occupy anti-capitalist? Should it be? And in what way? Like, what does it mean to say that it is or is not anti-capitalist, or should not be anti-capitalist?
My anecdotal demography supports of the organizers and participants supports the sorts of things that the response letters would say. I mean, I think some people identify as anti-capitalist, some people don't. I think that one way in which you're really right, Eric, is there is a need for a clarification of what we mean by capitalist and what we're opposed to, and I think a lot of people just don't know. I mean, some people will say capitalist means this, other people mean capitalist. I mean, I think the fact that you haven't been able to even say the word capitalist or anti-capitalist for however long, and you are now, we are able to have that conversation in a new way is really vital.
The way the question was originally written also included the idea of the 99% versus 1%, and I don't, again, want to say what I think Occupy is. I really am the last person on the panel who could assess. I do think that Occupy will at some point figure out its stance vis-a-vis capitalism. In some form it'll become clearer, that's fine. It might take some time, that's probably good. The longer you take to arrive at something, hopefully the better people feel about the sort of solidification of that process. The concern that I have, the slogan 99% we are the 99%, they are the 1%, that has obviously had major resonance. I also think it's probably at some point going to become the biggest problem. Within a movement that doesn't recognize that there are more than two classes, and that class is actually a little bit different from just how much money you have and or make. And I don't want to get too into the nitty-gritty of this, but it has to do with relationship to the means of production. It has to do with access to power. And there are varying degrees of this, and there is in our society, and there could be in any future society, a coordinator class, a class that has tremendous power, that doesn't necessarily make as much money or have as much wealth as the 1%, but that has a different alignment. Now, there are remnants of this class, not remnants, there are pieces, shadows of this class inside Occupy. And we see this. We know that there are different levels of privilege. We know that looking at 99% as a monolith and not talking about race, not talking about gender, not talking about all sorts of different gradations of privilege within a movement is probably going to, a lot of us understand this, I think, and those that don't need to acknowledge this, this is going to come back and be the biggest enemy of Occupy. It can't be just 99% versus 1. It has to be, we have an understanding that this is a complex situation, that there are differences in relationships, that there are prefigured classes that we come into the 99% with, that the 99% bring to this. So I'm not against the slogan per se. I think that it's a great rallying cry in a lot of ways, but I do think that, I hope that the conversations that are going on among folks who are involved are starting to really acknowledge this. It doesn't mean you kick anybody out. It means that you just don't pretend that everybody is exactly the same, that everybody comes to it with the same amount of power, and that everyone's going to have and deserve the same amount of power without focusing on it and drawing attention to it and finding processes that enable us to equalize, that enable us to shift privilege. And I think that caucusing and identification of these things is a start. It needs a lot more work, but I don't think that's news to too many people right now, and I'm glad to see that folks are working on it.
So I don't think at this point Occupy could be an anti-capitalist movement. I don't really agree with the term as it's used as anti-capitalist. You might be able to register an opinion of, say, a majority of a movement that they subscribe to anti-capitalism, whatever that might be. But you wouldn't get that, and Occupy doesn't include any processes for coming up with that sort of thing. To be opposed to capitalism would have to mean, as a movement, that you are in some way part of a process which has the capacity to overcome capitalism, which I think is possible through socialism, and I don't see other possibilities. People advocate different kinds of anti-capitalism, and that's a wider discussion, obviously, but I think many of the other kinds of anti-capitalism which don't exist on a global level or don't exist with a planned economy, that don't overcome the tyranny of the market and the blind determination by structure, the anarchy of production, all of these things need to be solved for a society to overcome capitalism. So to be anti-capitalist would have to mean that you're in some way contributing to such a development. And I think OWS is contributing in certain ways, but I don't think anti-capitalism would be the word to put on it. I also think socialism would be the word to put on it. It's developing consciousness in certain ways. It's not, at this point, preventing capitalism from operating. As to the term, the 99%, I don't entirely agree with the way you're theorizing classes, but I share some hesitation about the term the 99%. I think for a movement to say that it speaks for the 99% places the movement in a bind of either being demagogic and claiming to speak for people who it doesn't really, or to accept the least common denominator sort of way of going about things, and saying that it will only speak in ways that everyone can already immediately accept. The fact is, movements are self-selecting groups of people, and because by virtue of there being movements, they're controversial. They're ideas which are not already universally accepted within society. They can represent a wide majority of the people in the society, but it's not clear that 99% is the same thing as the people who would benefit from an overthrow of capitalism, for example.
So I essentially agree with what everyone has said, which is that there's no neat or clean way to call OWS. There's no neat or clean way to call OWS anything, actually, right? There's no way that any of us, let alone anyone in the world, can speak for OWS as a whole thing, that OWS is anti-capitalist. So, and certainly, you know, the term I would use is ethnographically from actually having participated in it. I think there are, you know, people's orientations to capitalism vary widely. But I do want to talk about capitalism not as a theoretical and historical, I want to hold many kinds of capitalism in tension. There is capitalism as a theoretical and historical construct, which I would be all in favor of overthrowing, whether it was by, I mean, there are all kinds of ways to think about revolution of that theoretical and historical concept. There's also capitalism as we have been living it, in particular, you know, I would say since, you know, different people want to put the beginning of the neoliberal era at different times, but let's just say however all of us conceive of the neoliberal era, right? So actually right now, something that looked like true, and I'm going to sound so bourgeois, and I apologize, I do it self-consciously, something that looked like true campaign finance reform, the separation of what we used to say church and state, right? We say this in Occupy all the time now, the separation of corporation and state. If we could find a way to do that meaningfully right now, I actually think that that would revolutionize the ways that we've been living capitalism recently. It would not revolutionize it in the way that socialists want it to be revolutionized. And this is not me saying this is what I want and this is all that I want. I think that's actually these kind of bougie, campaign finance reform and constitutional amendment that bans corporate personhood. I agree that in certain ways they perpetuate forms of capitalism that long predate neoliberalism that are themselves problematic. Ross always said in the think tank, don't idealize Fordism, right? I mean, that's not what we're out to do, but I do think it's really important to understand the specificity of capitalism as we have been living it now, and that the specificity of capitalism for the last several decades is very different from before, and there are things that we could do in and of themselves that would be revolutionary. And I think one of the scary things about revolution is that it seems so big and so far away, and there are certain orientations toward revolution that make it seem unattainable because it is only revolution if it looks like X. And I think one of the things that Occupy Wall Street is doing is kind of maybe opening up, ideally, what the revolutionary imagination could be, and saying, well, what would be revolution, like, what do small forms of revolution look like that don't necessarily, and I understand the danger in this, but that don't necessarily perpetuate or re-enable, allow capitalism to stage its own death just to be reborn afterward in a stronger way. So that's one thing that I would say. On the 99% thing, I'm sorry, I'll be very brief. I wish all of you could come to a spokes council meeting. In fact, all of you can. And I invite all of you, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So far, we've been having them at 56 Walker.
Is that 74 Trinity?
Well, tonight it's at Trinity, yeah. So, at spokes council meetings, by far, the most controversial thing you can say, and it is always said by an educated white woman or man, but we're all here for the same thing. Oh my God, the room just erupts, right? Fuck you, excuse my language, but that is generally the response to that. It's like, no, we are not all here for the same thing. It is a lovely and bourgeois sentiment to imagine that, but many of us are here for all kinds of very different things than you, Hannah, educated, privileged, white woman, are here for, right? So I think that the divisions of race, the divisions of class, the divisions of homelessness, these are so raw and on the surface. In fact, they derail every single spokes council meeting. They derail every single spokes council meeting. I happen to be in the minority that thinks that's a good thing. I think that the derailing of these meetings has been incredibly powerful, and the rawness of these wounds and the way that we are forced to take account of them, the way that some people in the People of Color Caucus are forcing us to take account for them, but even more specifically, people with mental illness are forcing us to take account of them. People who have been chronically homeless are forcing us to take account of them, is incredibly important. So I actually am willing to sit through a meeting that seems like it's not getting anything done because it gets derailed by people who are saying, you are racist, your process is racist. I'm not comfortable overriding that kind of tension to say, hey, wait a minute, we're actually talking about how to make this action happen tomorrow. So I do want to just say that the 99% is radically divisive, divided, at odds with one another, and I think that that's a good thing.
There's so many things in what you said that I wanted to respond to. There's a lot of good stuff there. First of all, I want to pick up Eric's pointing in too, that really not everybody can come to a spokes council meeting. And that's important to recognize. And I think one of the real strengths of the Phase 2 direction is that it opens the door for new forms of organization to enter the movement. You can have more traditional organizations, labor unions, community organizations, and so forth, even ones with hierarchies, to interact with the movement in a constructive way. And that opens the door for much wider participation. I mean, I thought of this it was clear at Occupy Our Homes when one of the speakers said, oh, this movement just got a whole lot more colorful, because its whole mode of operating had just changed. Second of all, I think your point about derailed meetings is really important. Some of the most important meetings I've been to in this movement have been totally derailed. And a lot of the stuff that takes place, including, for instance, Occupy Our Homes, is not so much approved by consensus. It's something that people do autonomously after going to a lot of meetings and hearing, where the group basically is, and then realizing, okay, it's probably going to be cool for me to go ahead and do this. And so I think a lot of people, they go to the meetings and they assume that the point of it is to come to a consensus decision. That's often not the case. The other side of the coin is that this model of decision-making assumes that you're actually doing a lot of stuff by your own volition, trying to take into account the general sense of the whole group. Finally, I think your term small revolution is really valuable. And this really hit home for me, especially while I was attending meetings for the other occupation whose planning I was covering over the summer. One of the members of which, organizers of which is here, they tended to, this was the group that is still occupying Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C. Beginning on October 6th, and they were planning well before Occupy Wall Street was even called for, remarkable simultaneity. But in that group, rather than being the kind of young anarchisty student type, tended to be older, more experienced. A lot of them had had real confrontations with, say, the Democratic Party, even the Green Party, and in trying to enact what they saw as common sense reforms like single-payer health care, drug reform, any sort of reduction in the military budget, or any sort of sane discourse on war. And they just hit brick walls because of the corporatist problem. And in conversations with those people who had had this kind of trying brick wall experience, it became clear to me that, or it was clear to them through their experience that really a revolution was necessary for common sense to take effect. And they kind of talked about revolution as something like a constitutional convention, a radically different way of making decisions and electing officials and structuring our government. So I think one of the strengths of those meetings was the sense in which in which a lot of our most modest objectives for this country really might require what seemed like quite significant changes.
And I mean, on top of that, I think worth thinking about again is the sort of European situation wherein you have countries that are a lot more democratic than the United States, that are actually right now sort of democracy is quickly being replaced by technocracy in order to manage this steamrolling economic crisis. And I think, again, it's important to sort of keep that international perspective in view in a way that we don't always, but that certainly at least provides some doubt or question about what does it mean to say, oh, well, if only we had less corporate money in politics, like things would be great. Well, Europe has less corporate money in politics than we do, has for a very long time. And, things don't look very good right there right now. I did want to sort of bring this around, in part because the experience of people on the panel, to the kind of question of the demands of the movement. So there was some talk about the kind of self-gestation process of the movement, and I'm kind of curious, like, on one hand, what is that self-gestation process of the movement? Like, what are the kind of techniques in place for people getting to discuss, look, what should this movement stand for? What are its goals going to be? And how do you think the kind of controversy that happened a little earlier about whether there should be a broad set of demands or whether that would be a kind of co-optation of the movement would narrow down possibilities, how that plays out. And you were thinking about how the movement's going to generate ideological possibilities for the future. Sorry if that's vague and big.
No, it's not.
Tell me it's not. Thank you. I appreciate that.
My thoughts on this, I want to introduce a couple of sort of weird ideas. First, it's not at all clear to me that Occupy is a movement. Occupy may or may not be a movement in and of itself, or it might be part of a larger movement, which makes it weird to call it a movement. It might be an organization that fits in the context of a movement, or it might be almost more of like a trademark movement that, excuse the comparison, but like the Tea Party that has a defined thing and it's kind of its own contained unit. If it doesn't want to participate with sort of standard kind of left organizations and whatever that are out there, and so far the evidence is that it does want to, but if it didn't want to, then it could call itself its own movement and kind of set its own definitions, boundaries, membership kind of identities and objectives, and then work to achieve them. Because it seems that it does want to fit in that larger context, I think that it's more of actually an organization, a coalition, some kind of different concept. But calling it a movement, I think, is very, very strange, because there's people who I think are in very aligned organizations that don't consider themselves part of the Occupy group or identity. You'll notice, I don't know if anyone noticed, but I haven't called it a movement I haven't called it a movement yet, and I think it's a phenomenon or maybe an organization. And it sounds like semantics, but I think to a lot of people outside, quote-unquote, Occupy, it's not semantics, and it seems strange for people to say, well, this is the movement, this is what's going on. Some people are doing that. I think most people, I hope, aren't. But if you want to work with other organizations or organizations that don't consider themselves part of Occupy, and you don't want them to try to start co-opting or seeping into Occupy in order to get the energy that Occupy has right now, there's no question that Occupy is on fire. Anyone with access to a newspaper can tell that that's the case. But the question is, do we want Occupy to be its own thing, or does Occupy sort of fit in with larger movements? And if so, that conversation needs to happen, and people who are involved in other movements need to feel that they are, in their own organizations, in their own capacities, also actors in a larger movement that Occupy happens to be one big body in. And that, I think, is probably key. If Occupy wants to go in another direction because it wants to maintain the identity that it has now, which we've already noted contains a lot of folks who you might label liberal or who are the Ron Paul / libertarian types, that's a different direction. It might take it in a slightly different direction. It's a different concept. I'm not saying it's not equally valid. It could get a lot done. And the areas where there's overlap and where the energy is there and where there aren't old left and traditional left organizations trying to work in concert with a new phenomenon, that phenomenon might on its own accomplish a whole lot that it won't be able to do in that context. These are questions that I think need to be discussed. And the other thing that I want to say is on this issue of demands, demand is such a bizarre word. It isn't a question of why everyone reacted when the media said, what are your demands? And said, well, we don't know what our demands are yet, or we don't have them yet, or maybe we don't want demands. Demands are one thing. That demand is something that you give to someone that you give authority to, and you say, give me this. Very typically movements start in one of two ways. They start with objectives, and demands are the kinds of things that might come in the form of legislation that's fairly specific, or rights that are not necessarily specific, but that are at least concrete and understood. Those kind of movements pick up speed very quickly, get a lot of people involved, and it's easy to articulate what the goal is, it's easy to get people excited about it if they agree, and they often achieve a lot. The other kind is movements that start with objectives that are fairly complex, that have more to do with structural change, institutional change in the defining institutions of society. These movements are much harder to get going, they're much harder to get people involved in, and they don't catch fire very quickly. Now we've got this strange third way that a movement starts, which is that it's kind of on fire from day one, and it's not clear whether it's one or the other of the types of movements, because the objectives aren't defined yet. So take the time that the movement is on fire, when there's energy and participation and all these people are coming out. This is kind of like what I said in response to the second question. The momentum is here, the time is here, the participation levels are there, and it's the kind of thing that we dreamed of 10 years ago, that we said if we can get people to come out and help define this movement, then we'll really be able to take off and accomplish things. Well, guess what? Occupy is at that stage where that participation is there. And the greatest advantage is that the objectives aren't known. If you want to be a movement, though, I do believe, and make that word useful, you do have to have objectives eventually. You do have to say, well, we're at this point and we're trying to reach this point. That's kind of where the idea of movement comes from. Right now, what Occupy is kind of an animation. It's a very active group of people, and it's just starting to form objectives. And the tactics are taking, not just symbolic, but are going into the streets and into the communities in ways where you can start evaluating progress. This is a really good thing, but there's a whole lot of room there to keep defining that and take the time to do it.
So I think that there's a sort of a difference in way that a lot of people who are in favor of demands view the idea of demands, and the way that people who are critical of demands view the concept of demands. I just wrote a couple. I was asked to answer these questions. I just wrote a couple of things. Demands are the means by which a movement addresses the existence of power in society. A movement that makes a demand presumes to dictate what should happen to the power on which it makes the demand. It concedes no right for that power to decide how it feels about the demand. Semantically, it is in no sense a request. This is true regardless of the power, of whether it has the power to achieve the demand, or whether the power exists to deny the demand. The abolition movement demanded the end of slavery. It did not have the means to carry this out except if it could organize an insurrection in the South, or if it could get the Union Army to abolish slavery in the South, which is eventually what happened. But it was still a demand. The Occupy movement makes demands all the time, as do all movements. The Occupy movement demands an end to police brutality. This is what the Oakland port blockade of a few weeks ago was about. The Occupy movement demands that the various port employers observe the ILWU's jurisdiction. That's what the action on the 12th will be about. When the people were kicked out of the park, there was a motion put in to invalidate that order. There was a court action. That was a demand on the courts, that the people should have the right to continue to occupy the parks. When homes are given back to the families that have resided there, that is a demand that the people have the right to continue to occupy in their homes, regardless of what foreclosure proceedings have happened. Demands are a way that the movement communicates what it wants, and it doesn't have anything to do with asking power whether it will concede something. It expresses an intent to do this, and in this way it overlaps with what you're probably talking about in terms of objectives. But a lot of people who are in support of demands don't at all see it as a request. On the other hand, some people do see it as a kind of motion to support a particular bill or support a particular constitutional amendment. And I think in this regard, the kinds of demands that a movement puts out are actually extremely important in determining whether it's co-opted or not. There are demands that will co-opt a movement. If the OWS movement starts issuing demands about particular bills in Congress, which are supported by Democratic legislators or something like that, it will be very easy for them to co-opt the movement. Or the Obama jobs bill, that was the demand, the movement to be co-opted. Also, the absence of demands raises the possibility that the movement will be co-opted. The fact that people were not kicked out of the parks for as long as they were, in many cities, was a reflection of the fact that they had some support from Democratic politicians who thought that they could benefit in some way. And if we really don't want the movement to be co-opted, which I think is of paramount importance, then it's necessary to issue demands which will both sharply differentiate the movement from the kinds of people who would like to speak for it, such as the Democratic Party and the labor bureaucracies, or, sorry, I lost my train of thought. And, never mind, I'll close there.
I thought maybe it would be helpful to give a little bit of a genealogy of demands in the movement, at least especially in the early side, just so we're all on the same page. I mean, the initial Adbusters call, right, said at the top, on top of the ballerina on the bull, what is our one demand, right? I mean, they had this kind of Tahrir type idea. You unify around one thing. My conversations with people from Adbusters were interesting. Carl Lawson, the kind of elder founder of the magazine, said, "Well, I always thought of that as kind of metaphorical," and the younger guy, Michael White, was more interested in trying to pragmatize the left and organize this around something achievable. It was interesting to watch in the course of planning both with Occupy Wall Street and the October 6th movement that would occupy Freedom Plaza, that there initially was a lot of discussion about what a demand could be, and it tended to dwindle away, in my experience, toward something, through a certain kind of analysis, through an analysis of what the movement was capable of achieving at a given time. And I think that's why Phase 1 was so focused on the spaces and on the occupations, is there was a sense that this is kind of all we can, we're 100 people sitting around in a circle, or we're 15 people sitting around a table. What we can demand right now is this, with the idea that you make demands according to your ability to exert power and your ability to fulfill them. And I think what's happening as the movement grows is that demands are clarifying as the movement comes to a position of power where it's able to exact those demands. When it's at a point when it can do anti-foreclosure actions around the country, then it's able to start demanding through its actions, things very specific about anti-foreclosure. So I saw this question of demand unfolding as a kind of strategic decision about what this group of people was capable of accomplishing and of really exacting out of the society as a whole, and the kind of transformation it was able to accomplish.
I just wanted to say that I really like what everybody's been saying, but in particular what Eric just said, two things. First was a critique of the sort of anarchist response to the idea of demands, and this idea that a demand legitimizes power, as I understand it, and I am trying to become more conversant in sort of anarchist political philosophy, but it seems like that particular critique of the idea of demand, that demand legitimizes those in power by asking something of them. And then Eric said, hey, wait a minute, a demand, no, that's okay. Turn off your cell phone.
No, it's my alarm to keep us on time.
Shut up, totally. Okay, I'm going to be really quick. So, and I think, and Eric is saying, hey, wait a minute, semantically, it doesn't necessarily do that, right? It doesn't necessarily legitimize power. And he gave a historical analogy of the abolitionist movement, and I really like that, right? He said, their demand was to abolish slavery. That was a structural, systemic demand that there was no way processually that they, in terms of procedure, in terms of process, that they could have imagined achievable probably at the moment where they first articulated that. And in terms of dreaming big, and now obviously I'm just going to kind of go the opposite direction from the direction in which many of my answers have gone, I actually think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that this goes back, this goes back to what Brian was saying earlier in terms of is Occupy choice 1 or choice 2, right? And choice 2 was, is Occupy eventually about systemic change? And it would be my hope, again, I obviously do not speak for the Occupy movement, but it would be my hope that Occupy is about and will be about systemic change. Now, how exactly that will come to be articulated, I think is, for better and worse, a question of process. So that was the first thing that I wanted to say. And the second thing is just very brief, and it's sort of provocative, but it's provocative from being naive, which is that, I'm actually a little skeptical about all this talk of co-optation. And again, this may be because I'm a naive activist. I openly admit that. So I'm just going to put that out there, because it seems to me that there's a lot of anxiety floating around out there. Is Occupy going to be co-opted? It's already co-opted. Some people work with MoveOn.org. Some people work with it. Now, I participate in Occupy pretty regularly. Again, I may be totally naive. I don't feel co-opted. Sometimes MoveOn.org sends me something, and I'll say, hey, sure, yeah, I'll put my name on that petition to add another one. I don't feel like my political will is then co-opted by MoveOn.org. Again, this may come from naivete, and I would just like to put that out there as something I'd be interested in kind of hashing out in the question and answer session.
I want to quickly respond just on the demand thing. I was just using that more common understanding of demand. I think I essentially agree, basically. And I don't mean to even suggest, I think that none of us then think that having a demand does not legitimize. I think what I said was that you make a demand to something that is, what I meant by legitimate was something that you can address. So that was, I don't believe this, and it is kind of almost a fundamentalist concept, that by demanding something of something that you philosophically recognize its legitimacy. That's absolutely not true. So
I think that's worth pushing back against. I mean, there's a lot of what this movement is about, or has done, I shouldn't say is about, has done among people I've observed, is a sort of radicalizing experience. A lot of people come in with these frames that we all get constantly. I mean, we just spent all summer after the Arab Spring, like talking about Iowa straw polls and these ridiculous, like, non-debates among politicians who are all funded by the same people, and and are basically promulgating the same stuff with different style and scrutinizing their sexual lives and this passes for politics. I mean, it's amazing. And people come to the occupations, and suddenly you don't hear anything about either Sarah Palin or Obama or anything like that. And they're talking about what they need and what they themselves hope for their lives and for their families and so forth. And so I think that there actually was a lot of value in not framing in this kind of anarchist conceit of not framing the movement's message or orientation toward government. Framing it toward the movement itself and saying, the first document that was passed by the General Assembly. By the way, these very interesting documents that have been passed by the General Assembly have been completely ignored by the media. And when we talk about, there's been no demand, I mean, has been very interesting messaging coming out of the consensus process of the General Assembly that's worth looking at.
On the minutes, NYCGA.minute.
Absolutely. And the first one was Principles of Solidarity. It was a document about what we stand together for as a community. The second one was a declaration, which was a call for occupations around the country and around the world. Again, they're addressing not government. It's saying government isn't what matters, first of all. All these documents complain about things in government and the banks and so forth, but it addresses the people. It assumes one another as the audience for this movement. And I think that is a very, very powerful characteristic. The third document was a good neighbor policy. Again, how to behave. And then a statement of autonomy, which is how we interact with the larger community. Very, very interesting documents, and which again, all presume that the audience is fellow citizens, fellow human beings, rather than structures of government.
Okay, really quick, because
I agree with something that he said, which is that a demand is not entirely directed to communication with the government. It's to communication with people who are in the movement or who we'd like to see in the movement, or who we may have areas of agreement with. And for that reason, demands can be constructed to appeal to the interests of particular people, and they can come from those people. And these demands are already out there, and it is important for the movement to recognize what they are and get on board with those.
I mean, just really quick to sort of point out something I think is in common, or maybe make a finer point. I mean, Brian, your sort of distinction between different movements, I think that interesting predecessors of what's going on now could be, on the one hand, sort of abolitionism, that has sort of a very clear idea of an absolute wrong that it then asks the rest of society to catch up to. We don't give a shit if we don't have a majority. Slavery has to end, and we'll wait for you to come to us. Versus the sort of the 99% ideal, which is much more, look, we share a set of interests, we have something in common, which is all of us, which is that whatever, we're poor, we're being screwed over, etc. And then, I mean, sort of classically, it seems to me maybe Marxism stood somewhere in between, which was we share a set of interests, which is the absolute end of capitalism. And so, catch up, that's where the moving train is going or something. But I think sort of figuring out what box exactly, or what the right model is part of what I've heard in discussion before, and I think worth thinking about. Sorry, very at the end, I just a kind of big general question, and then we'll open to everybody else joining the discussion. Thank you for your patience. Was just the fantasy question of if Occupy, what would it mean for Occupy to succeed, and can it, in your mind?
Well, it hasn't defined any condition for success, so you can't really evaluate whether it has succeeded. It has succeeded in politicizing, many thousand people. It hasn't disrupted Wall Street to any great degree. It hasn't disrupted capitalism. It's disrupted the Port of Oakland, and it may do so again. And that's significant, and it's disrupted a very tiny slice of real estate, finance. And it's successful in those grounds. But, success of the movement, it needs to decide, or the various visions of what it should do need to be articulated, and then we can evaluate success on those things.
I'd like to see Occupy continue to bring people out of the various woodworks. One is people who haven't been involved yet, who are getting involved, getting energized, getting politicized, engaging in education, practicing activism. And the other is folks who are kind of like me, who have been around for a while and are cynical, and we're kind of going, the world's going to change, nothing's going to happen. I'm famous for a couple of statements. One was, among my friends at least. One was, no, I'm not going to go to Seattle because I don't want to show up to another thing where only 2,000 people come and we march in circles and nobody notices. And the other was, this Occupy thing, the first rain they're going to go home and everyone's going to forget about it. So that's the grain of salt with which you can take my advice. But I do think that Occupy has accomplished a tremendous amount just by reminding us that there is energy. And I don't think that institutions have changed. I don't think that major reforms are right around the corner, but I do think that the energy is there, and I do think that energy is the main ingredient, the first major step to making that change.
I think that this movement is, and I do think movement is a fair term, is predicated on having watched other movements around the world change things, and put and exercise the power of people in large numbers against the power of interests that are far too comfortable and far too powerful. And what I think needs to happen if this movement fulfills that hope that made it possible in the first place, that made all these largely kids get beaten up by the police for a few days until people started to notice, is to follow through on that, and in some way, and in some positive way, bring about some serious change in the structure of power that some people at the top right now really don't want.
I guess I would say that I'm sort of an unabashed zealot, obviously, but I think that for 13 weeks, Occupy has succeeded. Again, that's not to idealize it. There's a ton of really, really difficult stuff that we all continue to deal with, and to the extent that we're all marginally sympathetic, I consider us all occupiers. When I say we, I'm not referring to some magical group that I'm a part of, and you out there aren't. I mean, all of us who consider ourselves marginally sympathetic and critical. It seems to me that one of the key goals of the Platypus Society and sort of a genealogy of the left in general has been the openness to criticism and even antagonism in the process of politics. And I think that OWS is really bringing that to the fore for a lot of people. And I think that that's really exciting. So in that way, I'll just be sort of Pollyanna-ish about the first 13 weeks. I think going forward, and now I am going to recall the funny explanation of me. I mean, it's lovely. I know you found it on the internet, but about the work that I do in my other life. I think that Occupy will succeed, and this is drawing a little bit on what Nathan said, if it recognizes that what we are dealing with is fundamentally global. So this is a global movement. And I think there's a growing understanding of that within Occupy. We've had visitors not only from the Indignados, visitors not only obviously from Egypt. There's a tremendous amount of back and forth between Egypt and here. Not only, but we've also had, I was actually at Occupy Oakland for a month, and there was an incredibly rousing presentation by the landless workers movement in Brazil. I mean, there's a large, there's kind of the what took you guys so long vibe from everybody else, and we're like, yeah, sorry. But I think that, because I do work in the transnational oil industry and US-based corporations in Africa in particular, I think that while what Nathan said so beautifully, that we're not trying to address government, I think a lot of what we are addressing, a lot of the sort of implicit citizenry that we are addressing is first citizenry, right? It's not even illegal immigrants, let alone people who are citizens of other countries. And I think that if capitalism in various ways is at the root of what Occupy is doing, which it is, then capitalism is fundamentally not a nationalist system, and that's something that we need to think about a lot more and a lot better going forward.
Okay, so I want to open it up to everyone to kind of treat this as a general discussion. What I'd like to try is just to take one person at a time and see if that works. We can take more than that, but I'd like ideally for each person to get sort of their say and for the guys up here to respond. So I ask that you keep your comments or questions relatively short, and the panelists keep your comments or questions about said comments or questions relatively short. And we have some time in our hands. And please, I think there's still food in the back. So yeah, please raise your hands. Brian has a wireless mic here. We ask you just to speak in it for recording purposes. And the lady over there.
Testing.
So one of the things I heard Brian say that I thought was interesting was that he said that Occupy Wall Street was on fire from day one. And as somebody who was there on day one and then watched all day at work on live stream on day 6, it didn't feel like we were on fire until the pepper spray incident in Union Square, or the response to Bloomberg's cleaning the park, or even most recently, UC Davis, those terrible images. And so, as much as I've been so excited by the documents that have come out of Occupy Wall Street, I think it's interesting for me to just kind of reflect for a moment and think about what is the Occupy movement, and think about how much those emotional moments of interaction between protesters and the police really energized the movement and had, I think, a way of bringing so many people into it. And I would just like the panel to comment on that interaction between the police and the protesters, and how you think that tension defines or will figure in the future of Occupy in Phase 2.
Great, so do you guys want to
I'll first apologize for my geological kind of scope on things. When I say day one of a movement, I mean anything within the first couple of months is kind of day one. In that sense, I sit watching movements and analyzing movements and studying movements and just looking at them in such a long-term sense that I think that I probably gave a misimpression. Obviously, it wasn't literally day one, but it was pretty close to day one. I write extensively on this issue of police interactions with protesters. What hasn't been said is that I'm a street medic. I've worked at demonstrations. What I did during the anti-globalization movement was I was out there doing street medic work and constantly observing and watching and then dealing with the results of police interactions with activists. I strongly caution people from considering that a movement gets fuel from interactions with the police. I also strongly caution people from thinking that police reaction to you has anything to do with your level of success. Police do not, and mayors, do not react to movements because they're a threat to elites. It's possible that they do, but they don't necessarily. Sometimes they just hate you. Sometimes they just want to beat your ass. And the fact that they're beating your ass doesn't mean anybody has gotten anything under anyone's skin behind those cops. So, and I'm not saying that that isn't what's happened. I do think that's what's happened. And when we see a Republican strategist come out and say they're getting under our skin, that's more evidence. But we have to be very careful with this movement. Folks who are involved need to look back at what happened during the anti-globalization stuff and what's happened around the world when movements have come in conflict with police. It does have the effect that you're mentioning. A lot of people come out and say, hey, that's an injustice. It also has the effect of waking up a lot of folks who I think grew up really privileged and didn't understand that cops will pretty much beat your ass for almost any reason, as a huge portion of society already understands. And so as a street medic, I used to treated tons and tons of privileged white people who were screaming, I can't believe they did this, I can't believe they did this. And then people of color and folks who are more, experienced who are around were going, well, now you know, okay, you're caught up. But the clashes with the police are a major distraction. I'm not a fan of the police, but I am not a fan of the idea that they are our interface with elites. They are not our interface with elites. I'm also not a fan of the idea that the police are part of the 99%. I don't know where they fit, but they're not really going to come around anytime soon. They're institutionally opposed to what we're doing because of their allegiances with the 1%. But that doesn't mean that any relations that we have with them are necessarily conveying a response from the 1%, except that they are kind of that first line of defense, and they are very reactive. But they're very reactive. And they've been reactive to, I used to do consultations with animal rights activists who weren't accomplishing necessarily anything locally, but were getting their asses kicked very severely. So just keep that in mind. And I think energy comes from within us, and energy comes from the accomplishments and the successes that we have. It comes from the sense of community that we build as activists with each other. That's the kind of fuel that we need. The fuel that comes from the end of a baton is very, very temporary. And it may inspire a quick response and reaction, and it may energize you momentarily, but if you're going to be dependent on baton beatings to fuel your movement, you can kind of imagine where that might cascade to. So, not that anyone was actually suggesting that, but I just want to be very, very careful about that so I can overemphasize it.
Other responses?
I agree with what you said. The movement has grown faster than any of us would have expected, I think, and that's very good. But that's always how movements grow, and it will have to continue to grow at the present rate for a number of years in order to have the size and scale that is needed to affect the kinds of changes that are also needed. And in Egypt, confrontations with the police were very important. The protesters fought with police, they burned down police stations, they removed police from substantial parts of the city. And in order for that to happen, you have to have the entire city behind you. And that's the kind of growth that will be needed for a confrontation with the police to be meaningful. And then it becomes a confrontation with the state. But we're nowhere near that.
Do we want to take another question? Okay. I saw Ross up here.
Okay, so as Hannah alluded to, I'm a member of Platypus. I also I've been involved with the think tank organization, Vision and Goals, and a few other of the working groups down there. The question I want to raise for the members of the panel is models of social transformation. This was mentioned during the discussion as, and the way that it's usually conceptualized by Platypus is the model of reform, revolution, or resistance. And I think that resistance can more or less be kind of conjoined with the idea of prefiguration, creating a sort of like small-scale model of a society of the future. And I mean, one of the popular tropes that emerged during the course of the roughly 2 months spent occupying Liberty Plaza was that its participants were working together to build a small-scale model of what an emancipated society of the future might look like. This notion was itself largely predicated on the belief that the occupants were literally living out the dream of a just and more equitable society. The organizers of Occupy often pointed to the free food, first aid, and sanitation services offered at the park as examples of a needs-based provision of nutrition, healthcare, and so on. As someone put it, and by some I mean David Graeber has put it, I mean, unfortunately he can't be here to address this, but
so the worse for him.
Yes. These occupants were looking to create a vision of the sort of society they wanted to live in miniature. In so doing, many of the activists involved in Occupy Wall Street felt as if they were carrying out the Gandhian imperative to be the change you want to see in the world. This line of reasoning posits a very intimate connection between ethics, changing oneself, and politics, changing the world. Some radical thinkers of the past, by whom I mean Marx, have criticized this prefigurative tactic of social change, however. They have referred to such experimental micro-communities as attempts to realize, quote, pocket editions of the New Jerusalem. Such authors have raised the criticism that in order to build these castles in the air, the utopians are compelled to appeal to the philanthropy of the bourgeois hardened purse. Against this idea of leading by example, these thinkers have counterposed the necessity of carrying out a more general revolution throughout the whole of society, especially in its most advanced sectors. Applying this criticism to Occupy Wall Street, it is not difficult to see that most of the services provided at Liberty Plaza when it was still occupied were still dependent on funding received from donations, which in turn came from the Society of Exchange, or Capitalism.
Ross, can you wrap it up? Sorry,
Yeah.
I just want to cut it off.
Okay, since the means for the provision of these services may be viewed as parasitic on the capitalist totality, does this in any way complicate or compromise the legitimacy of such allegedly prefigurative communities?
Okay, one experience that struck me was when I was at that meeting in Greece with an Occupy Wall Street organizer, an anarchist, Marina Citrin, and she would push back against anarchists, but and representatives from different assemblies in Athens. She was kind of catching them up to date with what was going on with Occupy Wall Street. She said, "Can you believe it? We have this kind of weird thing in the United States that when people get excited about something, they give you money, you know." And everyone started laughing. You know, it was like this joke. And then she was like, "This is really bad. You know, this movement needs to get away from this money." And I think there's some truth to that, to the extent to which the General Assembly's had a pretty hard time figuring out what to do with $500,000 or more that has come in, and so, you know, I think a lot of the people from within are really concerned about this, and hope that insofar as this is a prefigurative society, it actually isn't really that dependent on donations in a considerable way, and actually it was done pretty cheaply. I mean, one thing that stuck with me is that a week before this started, at the last planning meeting, the grand total that was mentioned as having been raised was $800 by the Food Committee. For a national global movement, that's pretty cheap, and so, you know, I think it's important to recognize the extent to which this actually took place with very little money.
And I guess I want to say, in response to Ross via Marx, or Marx via Ross, or whatever, that I actually agree wholeheartedly with that critique. And I also agree with what Occupy was doing. And I do not think they are mutually exclusive. And I think one of the biggest dangers, I actually love Marx. I love Marx. But one of the biggest dangers, I think, historically, of certain kinds of Marxist politics is that they understand Marx in a certain way to the exclusion and detriment of every other possible strategy, that any other strategy that isn't sort of exactly aligned with what an originalist interpretation of Marx might say, and I use that word intentionally, obviously, because that's, you know, something that we haven't floating around in our own society in other contexts, makes everything else look bourgeois, parasitic, that it in fact, you know, makes it seem like it's destabilizing capitalism when it's not. And I would actually like to say that, again, I do not think that these strategies are mutually exclusive. I think that what might look like a Marxist revolution eventually, I don't think it's necessarily clear what it would look like getting there. And I think something like foreclosure, while some people have said it was wonderful and some people have said, oh, it's just a gesture or whatever, private property is one of the cornerstones of capitalism. And I think just to get to the point where we can say, you know, and arguably putting people back in their homes is still saying, oh, people should be able to own the homes and not the banks, right? I'm not saying that this is sort of a radical critique of private property, but at the same time, the banks own those homes. Those people do not own those homes that are living in them. Those people are effectively squatting in those homes. And so I guess I think that there are more radical critiques of capitalism within, sort of almost accidentally in the Occupy process than an originalist Marxist might give it credit for. And I say that as, I mean, I would call myself a Marxist. I know you would like, shoot me a death stare or something, but you know, I say that as a Marxist.
So I think that often these prefigurative actions are ethically admirable. You know, it's very positive that people are spending their time in this way, but I think it can be a distraction, and I think it does divert energy from political organizing. I think that what we should be aiming for is a society in which socialized provision of goods and services means at the highest standard in the most efficient way, which is something which individuals can't do and can't voluntarily organize in small groups to do. It means that you need to seize the means of production, that you need the capacities of corporations organized in a different manner in order to organize society. On the question of finance, it's perfectly apparent because there's nothing, finance is already socialization of capital on the highest level, and you would have to take charge of it at the highest level. There's no in-between step. You could provide loans to a couple of people, but that doesn't do anything about the power of finance as it exists. So I think prefiguration, it's fine, but I'm not sure that there's any way that you can see it, the bubble sort of merging into a larger sub-society which will then be resistant to capitalism. I think capitalism would overcome that.
I'm sorry, may I interject again? I guess I just wanted to say here that I think that rather than a distraction, and I understand that argument and I'm totally sympathetic to it, rather than a distraction, I think without either romanticizing or abstracting something called a working class, I think that it doesn't at all what we've been doing. It doesn't distract was your word from political organizing. I think in fact it is political organizing. In fact, I think we've mobilized more so-called working class people, that's actually a category I don't feel comfortable with, so-called working class people into political action than were mobilized before. If at a certain point, on a grand scale, we together are able to seize the means of production, that would be thrilling. But first, what it means is a certain form of politicization, a certain form of open discussion that is inchoate and we don't know what we're doing. But I guess that's what I'm saying, is that the means to mass mobilization aren't already known. But I think from participation, that's actually what I see happening, is mobilizing something that a Marxist might call the so-called working class. So.
Just to kind of interpret something Eric said, though,
Yeah.
I think it's important that the means to mass mobilization and the ends of mass mobilization are not necessarily always the same.
Right.
And there's, I think that the kind of story of the human mic is like an interesting example in this regard, because obviously it started just as like a very utilitarian means. We need to communicate. They don't let us use whatever megaphones, loudspeakers. And so we use this, whereas now it seems to sort of have this kind of democratic ideology. It's being used, you see people with microphones who are then being spotted back. And to me, the idea that in a future society we'd all be repeating each other in this way is horrifying and terrible.
It's not literal. Brian told you guys that before. Did anybody hear what Brian said? It's not literal. Come on, nobody's that dumb. It's not literal.
I do think there's a bit of a false dichotomy between these two ideas. The idea that it's either a microcosmic prefiguration of society that's on a farm or in a park somewhere, that's a straw man. That's something that people can decide to exercise as part of their activism now, and that's what Occupy Wall Street did, and that's fine. And we've all said that's, it's an interesting thing to watch for the people involved. It's very empowering, and it drew a lot of people here who said, I want to participate in that. Versus the idea that it's kind of a one fell swoop, we've got to seize the means of production, we've got to take over the powers of politics all at once, and then we can organize society as we want. I think that that's also, in a way, a straw man, or at least it's a bad idea if anyone is arguing for that. The idea is we can go into communities, we can build institutions, we can be engaged, we can participate in democracy on small scales, we can build upward from the ground, and we can challenge the top all at once, and we do not need to wait for a vanguard to swoop in, take over the White House or whatever, and nationalize the means of production and all that stuff. We can seize the means of production on small scales, workers can take over the factories, we can build alternative institutions. So I think that sometimes we get dichotomized, and I'm not sure that anyone here is advocating any of these things, except the idea that we need to be engaged now, we need to be participating, and not waiting and not just having discussions and hoping that we have that power someday down the road, or even just building for it without having any now. We take it now where we can, and we look to take it down the road where we can.
I'm sure there are responses up here, but I do want to get another questions from the audience, and then we can continue this. Brian, take it to somebody back there. Just go. There's so many.
All right, well, speaking as a member of the working class that might or might not exist, I work on the subway tracks of New York City as a member of TW 100, and I'm also a hardline Marxist for sure. You know, the working class part, maybe not, I guess. But as a supporter of the League for a Revolutionary Party, to push some of Eric's points about the working class and that just came up now to try to make it more concrete. Look, like, Occupy Wall Street in the response to it meant that my arguments in the local for mass action went from yes, that's a good idea to just yes. But it also, because I think the movement didn't have that kind of political clarity about what kind of movement was needed and how to get it, it meant that Samuelson, my president, who was the first to officially endorse Occupy Wall Street, could stand up at Saturday's mass medium to the whole local and say, where we are the 99% button, say, I endorsed Occupy Wall Street, and get credit for that, and did not actually propose any real plan to take that forward. And the lack of political clarity in the broader movement made it easy for him to get away with that. And this is a key union, right? It can shut down the financial capital of the world. And right now it has a tough contract battle coming up, and it's not set to do anything near that. 32BJ, the building and janitor workers, their commercial building contract is expiring January 1st. The highest paid member makes $47,000 a year. These are the most exploited and oppressed members of organized labor in the country, certainly in the city. They almost will definitely be forced into a strike. The Occupy movement means the energy it's generated gives them an ally, in a certain vague way, but concretely so far, it hasn't taken their struggle to a higher level. So it'll be a real test for what Occupy is and has achieved if the 32BJ workers go on strike. Will they shut down Rockefeller Center? Will thousands of activists flood Rockefeller Center to shut it down and say no scabs? You know, this is what the movement needs and what it means. And I think that point about working class and what that means, whether you want to use that term or not, clearly the movement hasn't done it's gone as far as it wants to go. So the 2006 Immigrant Rights Day that shut down more workplaces than Occupy has so far, that had more people in the streets than Occupy has had total, I think imagining things like that and how this could spark that kind of broader working class movement is important to have that strategy and clarity about what that means if we want to achieve things. We need to take into account the achievements, but also recognize the limitations. And so I think Eric's points about the working class need to be pushed further by the other panelists. I kind of wanted to push that debate further and see what happens with that.
Responses? I appreciate you dragging us out of abstraction.
I really like what you just said, except I would turn it around and say I don't know that we need to be sparking, that folks here or involved in Occupy need to be sparking anything. I think that the sparks happen mostly in the other directions a lot of the time in the best examples. So the organized labor is already active. Organized labor has been active in many ways. If we start seeing these groups merging, working together, it'll be really interesting to see the ways that they interface. But one of the things that's bound to happen is that the actual power of labor, as was just demonstrated, for instance, in the UK, when 2 million public employees went on strike, as was demonstrated here in the immigrant strike several years ago that you were just referring to. These are the kinds of things that are going to have an effect of really, really making new folks who are just coming out, who may not have a labor background, who may not have any kind of organizing or activism background, they're going to see that there's an interplay between the kinds of sparking actions that Occupy has done so far and that reverse effect. And if that works, that they play off of each other and that they find ways to interface and that they build on each other, that's going to be fantastic.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I mean, I think that, the way to approach this movement, if you're coming from an existing organization, is not, come on, Occupy, get it together so we can work with you. I think it's got to be much more like, okay, we're going to do something. We know what we want to achieve, and we're gonna see what Occupy people, if we're not one of them, can do to help us. And I think that's a lot of what was happening with the Occupier Homes thing. I mean, again, this is something that's been going on for years. People have been honing these tactics and cultivating a kind of ideology and a praxis for how to do this kind of stuff. They knew what they wanted, and they came to Occupy and said, let's roll. And the occupiers were like, yeah, we're with you. We're going to bring some people out, and we're going to do it our way too. And I think that that's kind of how the labor synergy has to work in a lot of ways. Is labor's got to come halfway, and and act autonomously.
I agree with that. I guess I would say to you and all the informants in the room, if anybody's ready to shut down the subway system, we're ready to help you. I think that the idea, there is a demand, as Eric has said many times, there are many demands in Occupy Wall Street, and one of the demands is join us. And that's not to say join Occupy, identify as an Occupy. Do if you want to, awesome, but you don't necessarily have to. I think the idea of mass mobilization is mass mobilization. Let's all join in from whatever particular part we are a part of, from our communities, from our interests, from our class, if that's how you choose to define yourself. So we're all ready to mobilize behind that. And I think the Oakland port shutdown, the first Oakland port shutdown, which I got to participate in, is a really interesting example of that particular kind of synergy that you're talking about. The second port shutdown is a little more complicated, and that's interesting, but there's a whole bunch of people, a lot of people, a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of media ready to help you. Do you hear me, police? We're ready to shut down the subway system.
There are strategies that are motivating this movement, and they are changing all the time, and there will be changes in the strategies behind OWS, and we need to participate in those discussions. So it is constructive not just to say that everyone who wants to participate in the way they wish to participate should do so, although that's fine, but to have a real strategic discussion about which means of participation are most constructive. And no one thinks that the working class without organization will pass into power somehow. But what kinds of organizations have we found historically can be constructive to that aim? What kind of organizing work can people actually carry out? Which parts of society are strategic for organizing work? So I could advocate for positions on these, but that should be the kind of discussion, because in the absence of that discussion, there will still be a strategic discussion, there still will be a strategic decision, or an implicit decision at least, but it won't be obvious to everyone what it was, it will not be transparent, and it may not be the best that could have happened.
I did just want to point out one thing, and then I want to take more questions, but I think the gentleman whose name I don't know in the audience, but he, what is your name?
Jason.
Jason. I think one interesting thing that no one really commented on was this is sort of like the double-edged sword of the openness of Occupy, that like on the one hand, part of the whole sort of advocacy against, like for keeping it open is, well, the labor bureaucrats thus cannot co-opt us. But here's a way in which actually that openness is being used by the labor bureaucrats to say like, oh, see, we stand for freedom and justice and all this stuff that they have no right to sort of claim for themselves.
Sorry, I just want to follow up on that. That was an excellent point, right? It's like actually the way that the lack of demands or the lack of a clear ideology, or however you want to phrase it, allows certain kinds of depoliticization, right? It allows you the luster of looking like you're allied with Occupy Wall Street, but it doesn't ask you to follow through. However, I actually think there's a certain form of leverage there. He has come out publicly and said, I'm with Occupy Wall Street, and so it's saying, okay, well, here's the plan. And let's make it happen.
I think there are other ways to radicalize too than simply stating an ideology or plan, but I think these direct actions. I was during the Occupy Our Homes action. I was talking with an old left guy who's a major organizer with Occupy Wall Street about the co-optation, the fact that there were these city councilmen who were taking responsibility for all this and who were leading the speeches, and this was kind of heading downhill. And what are we going to do about this? And then we see a guy run by with a drill, and I thought that was really important. As long as there's a guy running around with a drill who just opened up, a locked house, I think these guys are going to have to, put their money or put their something where their button is, because as long as this movement is doing civil disobedience, is doing things that are dangerous, even on a small level, but in an escalating, is ever escalating, then people like that are going to have to take responsibility for actions like that, and that puts them in a tough spot.
Let's maybe get some more. Brian again. Go. Don't rely on me.
Yeah, my name is Andy Z. I'm from Revolution Books, and I just want to, in New York City, express appreciation first of all for Platypus holding this discussion. This was needed and did go on all through Occupy Wall Street, and it's very important right now. That's actually what our store is about too, in terms of having an atmosphere of a lot of ferment and dissent and contestation of ideas as part of getting to a whole new world. I did want to say that I feel it's a little constricted in how people are talking about this. And one thing is, I think at this moment we should really appreciate what has been accomplished and what remains to be done. And some of that was spoken to here, but I feel like there's a lot of, look, this spoke to a lot more people than were in Occupy Wall Street, which is why you have the Republican strategists saying, watch out for this word capitalism. It shifted the debate in society. Why? I don't have that full answer. None of us do yet, but it's worth thinking about that it's tapped very deeply into a tremendous world of hurt that people feel. And it followed up on how Tahrir Square tapped into that tremendous world of hurt. We can't forget this, and people mentioned Spain the year before. This is huge, and we don't fully have that understood. And revolution is not a set of categories. There are principles and theory that can explain this, but you know, we have to understand this, and that what was in Occupy Wall Street was a lot of different classes were in there. Middle class people, that is a class whose interest objectively lies with revolution. It is not just the working class against the capitalist imperialist class, although only the working class ultimately has an interest in abolishing all classes. Somebody referenced Marx. And I think it's important to pull one thing out of Karl Marx that's very important, is he said this revolution, the communist revolution, needed to be about abolishing all class distinctions, but also all the relations of productions, the division of labor that corresponds to, and all the social ills that arose before capitalism and are reinforcement, the oppression of women, the oppression of minority nationalities, and very importantly, the difference between those who work with their minds and the majority of humanity who's ruled out of that work, and then all the traditional ideas that correspond to it. I would say this: Occupy Wall Street tapped into all these kinds of aspirations, and yes, it's a big bouillabaisse, okay? There's a lot of different contention, that's good. But I think that if we want to get to that revolution, we actually have to recognize that will, just to take your challenge, you know, I can't see you.
Brian.
Oh, Brian, you said, well, I don't think there's anybody here who would think that a vanguard party is necessary. Well, I do. And I, you know, the bookstore that I represent, it has the Revolutionary Communist Party at its core, because there's a new synthesis of communism itself, developed by Bob Avakian at the core of this. But the reason I say that is if we're going to actually deal, if you start to think for a minute what it takes to overcome the division between those who work with their minds and those who've been ruled out of it, and the tremendous inequalities that exist there, which we experienced in the General Assemblies, just in living in the parks, and then in the interaction of the park from everybody else. Right there you see two things. One, that the pathways to change the world also contain their obstacles. And to understand that correctly, you will need leadership that's applying a scientific methodology. But then there's a problem. I'll be done. I'm just about done. Is that very leadership itself has to have a process by which it's actually exchanging with and interchanging with a larger society. And this is some of the things that we're about, and I've got obviously some literature here that I could get to people in terms of a new vision of a constitution for a new socialist republic. But I think it's very important that we be talking now about what is the problem, who are we speaking for in the largest sense, and then what is it going to really take to emancipate all of humanity, and not just who was in the parks.
Want to comment? I mean, about maybe the popular resonance of Occupy Wall Street and the.
I'm just on the. I have one point of agreement, which is what you just referred to as one of the divisions that I was talking about earlier, about that the 99% is not a monolith, is partly intellectual workers versus laborers. I think that sadly intellectual workers are the only ones that end up filling the ranks of a vanguard. And on the concept of vanguard, all I'm going to say is old ideas die hard, and I wish that wasn't the case, but they need to die.
Although to be fair, I mean, just on the level of history, the Bolshevik Party was not where this came from was not just intellectuals. It was like 50,000 people. It wasn't like 10 people sitting in a room, like 10 intellectuals.
And communism's a science. It's
Anyways,
changed.
but I think just on the historical record there. Sorry for that, Brian.
There's a longer discussion to be had on what a vanguard of a class might mean, and we don't need to have it right now. I do think that there needs to be organizations to carry out a revolution. There needs to be parties. There needs to be a revolutionary party. And I think the movement would benefit if there were a more open discussion of what ideas are leading the movement, what kind of leadership exists in the movement, whether we recognize it or not, and those who offer themselves up as leaders, what is the seriousness of their proposal? How an open consideration and critique of the various candidates for leadership of the movement, including those who may not make themselves known.
Is there anything else, or should we take more? More? Okay, let's.
Okay, so I also wanted to promote the new synthesis of Baba Bakian and make sure everyone knows about how great he is. No, I'm just fucking with you. What I wanted to ask was...
That's me.
That's appropriate. I have a direct...
I know what you're talking about.
No, I have a direct question. So I agree with all of you on the panel that Occupy Wall Street isn't an anti-capitalist movement, but it does seem like a critique of capitalism movement. And one thing I've noticed is that the critique of capitalism that OWSers seem to be attracted to is kind of threefold. There's the crony capitalism critique, where we should produce more locally, and things have gone bad in that way. There's the money speculator critique, that is somehow corrupting our economy. And then there's the parasitic finance capital critique, which seems perpetuated. And each of these three in order is the critique of Sarah Palin, Glenn Beck, and David Duke. And I'm wondering, to what extent does Occupy Wall Street offer a critique of capitalism that actually goes in any way beyond Sarah Palin, Glenn Beck, or David Duke?
Good question.
In terms of finance, what I find to be a very prevalent critique is that finance is out of control and needs to be reformed, and that government legislation can be successful along the lines of Glass-Steagall, which is regulation, something we may know about. I think that this is an inadequate response. I think that we need a more serious discussion about how to respond to finance. And I agree that this idea that finance is a special category which is parasitical in various senses is a problem. We're confronting capitalism as a whole. Finance exists in the way it does because it's functional to capitalism. If we regulate it, or if the US government regulates it in this country, it will still function.
So I actually couldn't see the asker of the question, but my response is something that I would address both to you and to Eric, actually, that I think that there is so much room at Occupy in all kinds of ways, whether you're able on one or more days, 7 days a week, to come down and participate in any kind of discussion. All discussions are open. Awesome, thank you. Hi. Are you standing up because it was you? Oh no, sorry. Oh, okay, thank you. Hi, sorry. So, because I think that the question of the most recent question we had, it posed 3 critiques that were then made analogous to existing right-wing Republicans. And I think that there are plenty of those down there. There are plenty of sort of bourgeois, let's invoke the Glass-Steagall Act, and I think and I don't necessarily say bourgeois to dismiss them, but there are plenty of liberals down there who just want to see that and nothing more, and I think there's room for them. There's also the radical economics working group. There's also the alternative banking working group. If you would like to start we need a revolutionary party working group, I would invite you to do that. In other words, now is the time to participate. Critique is also a form of participation. To come down there and critique, I think, is incredibly valuable. Ross did a lot of that. I think there's also room now to say, I do feel like there's an implied you in a lot of these statements, right? You need to start a revolutionary workers' party. You need to be sure that you're not recapitulating what Sarah Palin says. You need to... there is no you, unfortunately. I hate to break it to you guys, but there's no you. You're kind of looking at us, right? It's like, though we try to keep our jobs during the, I mean, we're all different. I try to keep my job during the day and participate when I can. I'm not, I mean, Glass-Steagall is fine. I don't think it's the end-all be-all. I would be more likely to participate in radical economics or alternative banking. It sounds like you guys would be too. It sounds like you guys might actually want to start a revolutionary workers' party or get the extant revolutionary workers' party down there.
We're different people.
Oh, there were two questions?
Yeah, I was joking about that.
Oh, okay. I guess to all three questions then, I guess I would say there is a lot of room. There is room. There is nothing but room. So let's get it going. Let's get it on. You'll find all kinds of people down there ready to get behind your ideas and come at them with antagonism, etc.
I would also just say to that point, I mean, there's also a genre of emerging discussions between Occupy Wall Street people and Tea Party people. There was just an article about a meeting in Richmond. I know a politician who's trying to coordinate things in that way around certain concrete goals. I think that the extent to which this discussion is predicated around Occupy Wall Street being a part of the left, I think what may be more likely is a rethinking of what the left means and of the political map in the country. I'm not sure about that, but every Occupy I've been to has had libertarians and other people, and they don't seem so off base for being there, and they keep coming. And I think there's a kind of reshifting happening here, and I don't think left captures it all.
Do you think that would be a progressive development, that kind of reshifting, or a confusion, or?
I'm not sure. I do think that one place where there's a lot of overlap, for instance, I mean, in addition to the campaign finance issues, between the far right or the kind of activist right and the activist left, I'd say the grassroots is also on internet regulation. And on keeping the internet free. And there's, within internet culture, we haven't talked about Anonymous here. I think that's a really important part of the picture, which was no small part in giving birth to this kind of energy and the quality of this movement. There's a libertarian tendency which touches things that are categorized with the right and left, and where people on kind of right and left sides of the traditional spectrum feel comfortable, and so I think especially in some of the digital, the questions raised by digital culture and its participation in this movement suggests to me that there is a legitimate overlap that goes really to the core, if there is one, of what this movement is about.
Do others agree, disagree? Comment? Okay, let's go back to the audience.
The police response to the Occupy movements have brought into focus an issue which is not necessarily central to the core economic grievances. Congressman Nadler, just a couple of days ago, called on the Justice Department to investigate the NYPD and other police brutal responses to occupiers. Here in New York City, we've had almost 2 decades of policing strategy under Mayor Giuliani and Commissioner Kelly, which has arrested thousands of people for doing nothing more than engaging in political protest, arrested 50 to 60,000 people each year for marijuana possession, apparently in contravention of state law, which makes it at most a violation as opposed to a misdemeanor, and has subjected tens of thousands of largely Black and Latino people to stop, question, and frisk practices for which they are never then arrested. And I do have a question, and it is, should policing abuses by police departments be another focus of the Occupy movement?
I think it's a really good question. I would point you and others who don't know about it. Stop and Frisk is actually an incredibly active working group within the Occupy movement. They've done a lot of really high-profile actions, including the action in which Cornel West got arrested. So Stop, Stop, and Frisk has actually been a really exciting working group here at Occupy Wall Street. And as somebody, I spent time in Occupy Oakland. I also live and I'm based in Oakland. And similarly there, although it's a slightly different genealogy, police brutality in Oakland has long been at the center of the majority of residents' experiences. So when you go to Occupy Oakland, the center of that movement is about police brutality, is about having to check a box that says I've committed a felony and that bans you from any kind of potential work, right? So the central issues of the Occupy Oakland movement are radically based on that context, and we in Occupy Oakland are then struggling, well, how do we relate questions of race-based marginalization and race-based violence to capitalism? Whereas at Occupy Wall Street, because of its particular location in Lower Manhattan in particular and the way that it started, it's kind of about the financialization of daily life, and then there's sort of tenuous connections made to race or tenuous connections made to immigration. So I think one thing I want to say first, just most basically, is that it is at the center in some very visible and very exciting ways at Wall Street through the Stop, Stop, and Frisk working group, but then at other Occupies, including the only other one I know well, which is Oakland, it is actually literally the central issue. And I think the question of the relationship of race-based violence and the perpetuation of capitalism is an important one. And I actually agree with what Brian said earlier, that cops aren't beating you up because they're afraid of you. They're beating you up because they're sort of institutionalized to be mindlessly violent in some ways. However, that very violence, despite intention, does have the effect of perpetuating a certain kind of system, right? It does have the effect of policing and defending capitalism. So I think that it's important to keep it at the center, as you seem to be suggesting, and make the connections to capitalism as a larger system.
I can't speak for Occupy, but any movement that wants to be relevant to communities of color absolutely has to address these issues. I think that's long been understood, and the hard part is, in some cases, of some white privileged folks to actually have the motivation to do that, and in some cases it's figuring out just how to do that interfacing with communities that people don't have experience with. And we're just watching in real time Occupy figuring this out and figuring out ways to do it, and I hope that they're successful.
Take another question. Behind me, right?
Hi. I have a very simple question. I just wanted to know, for 2012, is there anything concrete being planned? There's not much time. I was on Twitter yesterday just searching for Robert Shiller. He's a famous economist that was speaking in Chicago at the Drake Hotel. I have some friends there that were at that event. And there was somebody that tweeted about Robert Shiller, was not at that event, from California, who his Twitter profile is actually about future progressive democratic movement, and I think he's running out in California. So are there some kind of concrete plans to action as to getting people on the ballot for 2012? And I've been very active sort of since 1997. I'm actually a lot older than I look, and I'm happy about that. But been very active in sort of grassroots politics and in Europe. Lived there for 8 years, so I know a lot about what goes on in the world, and I think it's very important that people do and connect this movement to globalization and all of that. But it's essential that everybody take action, do work that is meaningful, because I think a lot of people talk about things and then they go back to their hedge fund job, and it's not necessarily how it's supposed to be to just talk about it idealistically. All of this, it's vital that everybody takes action for themselves. And politics is a key way to do that. You kind of have to work within the system. I'm an expert actually on the healthcare system and Medicare. So I work with a lot of older people around New York City, and I know how these issues deeply affect everyone, and everybody has to talk to each other, not just people in their 20s, not just people in their 30s, but to discuss how all of what's going on today actually affects everybody in their pockets, their families. It's just vital, and that's part of why I'm here. I've been so busy the last 6 months for work and haven't really been able to get involved, and I was very happy to be able to come to this event and know a little bit more about what's actually going on. A little bit disappointed because I just see a lot of talk. I really like to know what's concretely happening, and to start with, I'd like to know about what's on the agenda related to OWS for 2012?
I thought you said your question was going to be simple. I think that a first step to understanding this would be to start thinking about things other than electoral drives and processes as being concrete. I think that's a part of the experience that a lot of people have had here is that whether you elect a Democratic or a Democrat or a Republican, you get relatively similar policies as far as a lot of people are concerned, and that's the frustration that's driving a lot of this. That said, this process is not to be ignored. I've been kind of over the course of the last few months using Spain as a crystal ball, and I've been looking very closely, or as closely as I can, through correspondence in Spain for Wage and Nonviolence, at the election that took place on November 20th there, and
sorry, crystal ball.
Well,
result, right?
Yeah. Well, it depends on what you're looking for. I mean, the movement told people, no, let's vote. Don't vote for them, and the right-wing part, meaning don't vote for anyone, really. A lot of null votes were cast. The right-wing party won, but the left-wing party had already voted for a lot, or created a lot of austerity measures, and they found that neither party was working for them, and their call is real democracy now. They're putting their votes toward things that disrupt the status quo. They're trying to destabilize the Senate, which is a kind of which they see as an invalid institution in their government, and they've helped give a lot of new strength to small parties, which now have more seats in the legislature. So, that's one case in which the movement really concretely ended up doing something disruptive to the process. I think the United States is very different. We've had our particular kind of democratic process for longer. There's more faith in it, and I think it's likely that this could be a real split in the movement. On the other hand, today I saw some emails circulating about the conventions. I think that the 1968 prediction is likely. I think those are going to be major flashpoints, and I think they're both going to be flashpoints. I think both are for this movement a cause for protest.
I think the strategy of breaking with the Democrats and Republicans is very important. I think that any movement that tries to maneuver within the Democratic Party and get more progressive candidates in their structure will rapidly be co-opted. I think there's no space. It's a capitalist party. But even if it was a social democratic party like you have in Europe, and the strategy were to get people into Congress and have them try to press for better legislation, any party that attempts to govern the capitalist state will be obliged to rule in the interests of finance. This is seen throughout Europe. So I think it would be very valuable if there were some members of Congress who were socialists, who could actively criticize everything that goes through Congress. But I don't think that our strategy should at all be to try an electoral route whereby a majority is gained and then someone has the capacity to reform things for the better. I think that's a dead end.
I think what I'm honestly going to do, because we're about 9:15, is ask just for short closing remarks from up here, and then we have the room till 10, and there's food, and so then we can have kind of open it up to a more informal conversation.
No food.
Oh, we're out of food? Oh, terrible. Well, we have newspapers.
Yeah.
Okay, there were questions at the back. Can we take those? Yeah, so let's take those two questions there who've been up in the back for a while, I see. And then there's one up front, so let's take these three, and then we'll have a final thought.
I'd like to ask this question because I don't wanna stir up any controversy. There might be Ron Paul supporters in this room, but I've been coming to Occupy Wall Street since it started in September 17, and I'm there. I understand that people have different views of what Occupy Wall Street is all about, and and also the movement have been criticized for not having concrete message to a degree. But to me, it's the main point is about the mess that the capitalism has put us into, what the problem is, and you know, I've been debating with people who with these libertarians who support Ron Paul. To me, Ron Paul is a pro-corporate person who wants complete deregulation of corporations. He's against the poor. He's against minimum wage. Against equal pay for equal work. He against immigration, and to me, he represents what I'm actually at Occupy Wall Street to protest against. So I mean, libertarianism, or the original libertarianism was actually a type of socialism. The term that in the United States, people use it. It means something that's capitalist, but originally the socialist libertarianism was the original libertarianism. I think it's a type of anarchism actually. But the thing is, if you have like different groups, like these libertarians, this Ron Paul supporters, these anarcho-capitalists in a group, that's fine. Anybody's welcome. But the point is that. I guess if the movement means different things to different people, it kind of creates a conflicting message, because to me the Occupy Wall Street movement has been against you know, I mean, I don't know that everybody there exactly wants to overthrow capitalism, but to me it's in a position to what laissez-faire like capitalism has created. So I don't know. It's just a question of making sure that people there's at least some general idea of what the movement is about. I mean, there should be some general idea of what the movement is about. There shouldn't be something, because I know on the day one there were people there from the Tea Party and then the people you know, watch Fox News, and they're comparing the Occupy Wall Street to the Tea Party, how they're doing horrible things. But there were people there from the Tea Party there on day one. I've seen them. So yeah.
Thanks.
So,
okay, and there were two, Brian, quickly in the stack, and then all the way in the front.
Hi, sorry, real quick. I missed the discussion. I was at the labor outreach group of Occupy Wall Street that I go to. And actually someone here mentioned the MTA and shutdown, and they actually came to the workers group today, the MTA, and they're having a rally on the 15th, and actually everyone in the labor outreach knew how much power they had, all the other unions, and they had a whole group discussion, a breakout group on it. The other thing is Occupy the Bronx is very involved in anti-stop and frisk. I'm sorry that's not a question, there are more points of information, but I've been wanting to go to a Platypus thing for a while, but it always happens during Occupy Wall Street things. And I don't know if there was a discussion or not, or if I missed it, but I mean, I think the role of an intellectual a lot is to like decide what a thing is and name it and talk about it, and that can be very hard for a movement that's horizontal, right? Because they're using it as diverse as this fellow here and this gentleman here. But I guess it's not a question. I'm sorry for that.
Hi, my name is Mitchell Cohen. I'm the chair of the WBAI board, and I wanted to point out that everybody has that Occupy has a show on WBAI every weekday at 6:30. And it's been very good, although a little uneven, but it's been very good. And what I'd like to do is to get the tapes from this, if we could get audio off of these, to bring to BAI and put them on the air. So I think that would be great to have that. So if somebody who's running this could make that, to do that. The last speaker and some other folks made some interesting points about the need to shut down the transit system in order so the workers could meet their demands for new contracts that was fighting for. Well, I would say that it raises the question of, should people be shutting down the transit system to do that? Or should they be opening it up? Which is, I think, is the Occupy Wall Street, what Occupy brings into the movement. Open it up, make it free, run it free, occupy it, and let people use the system. And that way, it's not fighting for a demand in practice, but it's creating the reality we want to live in. And those sometimes conflict with each other. Now, of course, if the workers go on strike, of course, they'll support it. But there's another way of doing that. So I'd like to get some idea, if you see any speakers, if you see any back and forth over how to do these type of demand-type politics in labor, in the transit union and in others, and can we have that sort of effect, or are we forever bound like Sisyphus to do the same actions over and over again to get a better, barely a better contract, or barely save people from layoffs and so forth, which is really important, but it doesn't have the impact that it could have if done differently.
I think that's a great point. The Spanish did that. But that general point, I mean, in terms of they opened up their subways and tell people to go in for free and made it work. But I think that point about being creative about the kinds of actions that the movement is taking is really vital. And if you look around the world, every really exciting movement is doing things, is doing all sorts of new things. The Chinese movement, which is facing such extreme repression, is coming up with the most creative actions you can imagine. I talk to these guys and I just can't believe it. I've never heard of this stuff. And I think these challenges that this movement is facing should inspire it to be creative. That excites people, makes people feel like they're part of the future rather than the past.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, please.
Well, for instance, you can't even, talk about peaceable assembly. You can't even, if you have a rally in China, you're done, And so they have people just get out and stroll, and they coordinate this over the internet, and people find out about it through dollar, or through currency on which directions are written for getting out of the internet containment system. And so they're all told a certain place at a certain time. They do a new kind of flash mob where you don't look like you're in a flash mob at all. You just look like you're walking around, and the police can't tell who's a bystander and who's a participant. You talk about banner hangs. They'll put this is something that's been done, but it really worked out well the way the Chinese did it. They put up a banner on a balloon that was so big that the military had to get out a surface-to-air missile to shoot it down. I mean, and who knows who did it? And you have this huge banner hanging over the whole city for hours. Ways of breaking down people's fear through creativity are so important to the most repressive movements. Belarus is another great example. Silent protests. So you have silence outlawed. I mean, it's like the people standing around silently is now literally against the law. So you through these creative actions, you force power to do silly things, and suddenly power looks silly, and it has no power.
I wanted to address some of those too, can I? I just wanted to address the first question, which is I essentially understood to be, the scattering of Occupy Wall Street. We can say, there's libertarians there are Tea Party people there. And the thing that I want to say to it is that I feel like social movements gain their clarity in retrospect. So what did the civil rights move? I wasn't there, but I'm going to try to imagine, right, that if I was participating in the civil rights movement as a Black Panther in Oakland, or if I was participating in the civil rights movement as a devout Christian follower in Martin Luther King's parish, that would look like radical contention to me. And I would feel, in fact, that not only were we not part of the same movement, not only were we not fighting for the same thing, but we were at cross purposes. In retrospect, however, it's a lot easier for us to see with some clarity that these people, through radically different tactics, philosophies, strategies, ideologies, subjectivities, individual orientations toward what they were doing, were in effect fighting for the same thing. And I would actually say that the same thing is true of Occupy Wall Street. Not that libertarians and Sarah Palin fanatics and Tea Party people are all fighting for the same thing, but rather, whenever we participate in something, it looks much messier than when we read about it in a book. And I think that Occupy Wall Street, for those of us who have been participating in it, is incredibly messy, and that's really anxiety-provoking because that's not what it says in the book. But I actually feel like, and I'm speaking from personal experience, and I see the spirit fingers in the back, but for a lot of us, it's been an experience of letting go of that anxiety and just knowing, like, occupying our own political will and meeting people whose political wills and devotions we share and being changed by other people and allowing it to be okay that there are some weird Tea Party folks there. That's okay with me, actually, and I don't think it weakens us.
I mean, just, Hannah, to challenge you a little bit
Sure,
on that, I mean,
of course.
it would, I mean, you couldn't have a pro-Jim Crow person in the civil rights movement, right? Like, there was, like, a clear dividing line. The civil rights movement was for the end of Jim Crow, period.
So, no, I would actually disagree with that.
Really?
I'm going to speak ethnographically now. And what I mean by ethnographically is if we were there in 1962, somewhere, I would say that there were people that were around, actually in those spaces. Some people would say, oh, you're an Asian provocateur. Some people would say, oh, no, you have a totally different ideology. I guess what I'm saying is that actually, if you're on the ground in those places, there are all kinds of weird people up in those spaces, you know? And I think that that was probably true for the civil rights movement, too. And if I had time, I'd be happy to do the archival research and show that to you. So I think in the wake of it, again, it sort of gains a certain type of clarity that it doesn't have on the ground at the time.
Yeah, our columnist, Mary King, who was a part of SNCC and was very much involved in that movement, has echoed that in a lot of her writing on our site about Occupy Wall Street. That the sorts of impatience that people have, and especially looking back at the civil rights movement as kind of rose-colored glasses. And she, in a lot of the messiness that this movement is experiencing, she's recognizing a lot of what she went through years ago.
I don't have first-hand knowledge of the civil rights movement, but from what I can tell, the kind of police repression was of a very different nature to what we're experiencing now, and it would be very unlikely if there were any such people participating.
You mean that they would have stuck around? I'm not sure.
I mean, they would not have taken the risk.
I would just say that I think that I mean, you don't have to say a Jim Crow person so much as somebody who for instance, if you were a largely nonviolent movement and then a sort of Malcolm X figure came in, I mean, you could perceive that person as being directly antithetical to the whole thing. I mean, I think that a lot of the, I'll go back to my earlier point. I think that a lot of the people that one perceives as being antithetical to the movement should be arousing questions in us of, is there actually common ground that we're not seeing because we're used to seeing the world in a certain way?
But I mean, I think, Nathan, that's why the essential accidental comes to matter, because right in the civil rights movement, like, you could say something like, well, we all essentially stand together on the end of Jim Crow, and like a key principle is nonviolence, but we can accept that, like, you're going to disagree on violence, nonviolence, like, that is still within our ambit. Like, those are the kinds of things you decide when you start thinking about, okay, what do we most importantly stand for, what are kind of secondary, etc.
Well, I guess the parallel I draw is, like, I'd love to find somebody in the movement, who thinks corporations, should be able to give all the money they want to political campaigns. I mean, I think there are lines that are drawn. I think that, when you conceive of the movement as a manifestation of the left, you're going to see enemies within the movement. If you see it as maybe something else, that might be different.
And analogously, there could have been, and again, I don't know, I'm speculating, but just from sort of through ethnographic analogy, there could have been people involved in the civil rights movement, certainly, as you're suggesting, not necessarily subjecting themselves to that particular form of police brutality, but in meetings and et cetera, who come in and say, hey, I think slavery should be abolished. And now I'm speculating about white people. So I think slavery should be abolished because it's a perversion to capitalism. And so I don't really care, I'm not really for racial equality, but I'm for a pure capitalism, and so that's why I'm here in this movement. That weird white person, that weird racist white person, would agree with the fundamental tenet of the movement, but most people would be like, oh, agent provocateur, oh, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I feel like that's kind of those are the types of people we have floating around OWS, and I mostly feel fine with them. I think it's important to, I mean, just like if we look at it demographically, I think we're talking about like 5 people to 5,000 people in terms of, you know, who the Tea Party people are, who the libertarian people are. They're not an essential part of any working group. They're not an essential part of any direct action. I mean, they're a very fringe element, which is not to say that they're not welcome, but they're fringe and not sort of central to the movement right now.
Okay, their last round. I'm being vulnerable here to popular pressure, but then we really are going to stop. So I see 3. 1, 2, 3, and that's it. End of story. Damn it.
Okay.
It was on.
Okay. Well, just a quick comment and then a quick question. Just in response to the last exchange, no.
No.
To the last exchange that was going.
Just speak loudly.
Okay.
You're good.
I would put somewhat of a finer point on it, and I would challenge the notion that a Black Panther in Oakland and a Martin Luther King parishioner can actually be seen to have really contributed to the same cause. I think the point of sort of looking back historically is actually to parse out the political differences rather than paper over them. I do agree that is, you know, there can be a lot of clarity gained from sort of the historical critique or historical investigation, but I think it needs to precisely go in the other direction. But the question I had, the last question that was posed to the panelists before the floor was open to the Q&A from the audience was what would it mean, or what would it look like for the Occupy movement to succeed? I was wondering if the panelists maybe could say something to sort of the flip side of the coin, which would be what would it look like for it to fail? And I don't mean in the most general terms. You know, certainly, you know, it's dismantled, it fizzles out without having initiated any sort of transformation. And I don't even necessarily mean in slightly more specific terms. I mean the notion of co-optation has been discussed to a certain extent. But more specifically, what obstacles and dangers does the Occupy movement face strategically, politically, organizationally? Of course, the way one might answer that depends in a lot of ways on the way that one might answer the first question, which is what would its success look like? But bearing that in mind, I wonder if considering the other side of the question might be fruitful.
Our microphone is dead, so speak up.
So I have a question. Hannah, I support what you were saying about 99% being here for very different reasons, and you were also speaking about the welcomed failures of the Spokes Council in bringing all the voices out there. But that also brings the danger, of because the nature of that then would isolate potential, future supporters, especially as the what do you want to call this, a movement or a organization, as Brian was saying, potentially isolates people. I mean, like, let's be honest, most of the communist parties are really, really small because of their really rigid, structured nature, and Occupy Wall Street is opening up people. It might draw in more people, but might also turn off a lot more people. And so, like, depending on its role, if we see it as an organization, that doesn't take any positions, it would not be able to turn off as many people, and it would be more as a educational kind of hub, perhaps? Or how would you see that?
And then we had one more over there. Yeah. My question. We have a mic, a working mic. Go for it. Save your voice.
What does the panel say to people who want to be involved in direct action but are afraid of being arrested and losing their job as a result? And is the movement doing anything to defend people so they can get involved?
Okay.
Just on that last factual question, there's a legal working group, a bunch of lawyers who are defending people who get in legal trouble through direct action. And also I think it's important to see direct action in the kind of capitalized sense, that the direct action doesn't simply consist in arrestability. Every direct action that the movement takes. If there is an arrestability level at all, there are usually different levels, and people try to make clear, what the levels of risk are. But though often going on any march at all makes you vulnerable. So there are lots of other things you can do, like cook in the kitchen or do all sorts of support roles, insofar as there is a kitchen, which are in themselves direct action. Because they are directly providing things for the movement and strengthening it, but which don't involve confrontations with the police.
The movement failing would look like it failing to evolve. I mean, I think that there's these stages that we've kind of been referencing. We don't know what success looks like, as we've already identified. So what failure looks like is just not to continue to take those steps in those stages, which would, put us back to square zero. We're kind of at square one. Most movements make it to square one at some point. This movement has a really early and solid start on square one and has time to evaluate that and move forward. And not making it to square two wouldn't exactly be something disgraceful. It would just be, as it goes, eventually it may very well fail to evolve. But and I think I'll reflect what Nathan just said about direct action. Really, it's not important that you risk or get arrested to engage in direct action. Direct action is any action which achieves as a direct result of its activity the result that you desire, which means that you're not just out petitioning or doing something like this, but that you're taking direct action to make something happen. And there's tons of ways to do that without risking arrest. And the idea that movements fetishize arrest in a very strange way, and we need to make sure that that's understood, that is not, it's not necessary. It doesn't make you a better activist. It doesn't make you more committed. It often just means that you were more privileged, that you had more time on your hands, et cetera, that you could get through the system more easily. We all, once the movement understands that, we start to realize there's a million ways to contribute, and so many of them are direct, and so many of them will accomplish things much more directly than civil disobedience ever tends to. And there's tons of civil disobedience that is not direct action. If you lock yourself to your congressperson's desk, as has been done a million times over the years, it's not actually direct action. You're trying to get your congressperson to do something on your behalf. Fine, I'm not challenging the tactic, but there's ways to do direct action that are real and don't risk, don't involve handcuffing yourself to anything.
I think the problem that faces OWS is, in many ways, the same problem which has faced social movements in the U.S. for the past 100 years or so, which is that they become co-opted to one of the mainstream political parties, specifically the Democrats. And I think if OWS fails to take this opportunity to make clear its differences and to divorce its constituencies from their historic support for the Democratic Party, then that will be a failure. If in 2012 a substantial fraction move towards campaigning for the Democrats, and if others do not succeed in making very clear what is wrong with that, then that will be a failure. In terms of the evolution, there may be evolutions within the framework of OWS. If not, there will surely be other movements. But there are important things that have to happen very soon. There has to be great growth of this kind of movement, but also there has to be a clarification. And I've said what I think that means.
Okay, I just have a couple things. First, on the parsing of historical differences, I apologize if I misspoke or was unclear. That is actually, I agree with you. That is exactly what I was trying to say. I guess what I feel like is the papering over of political differences historically is what happens when we look at the civil rights movement as if it had a certain kind of continuity that it didn't in fact have on the ground. What I'm saying is it's important to recognize that there was tremendous political diversity and that wasn't necessarily a tragic weakness of that particular movement as people are saying it is of OWS. So I don't know if I shouldn't put words into your mouth, but that's what I was trying to say, is that political differences absolutely matter, and I don't think we should paper them over because it allows us to see OWS in an inaccurate light, I think. In terms of the question, in terms of your question, you started by saying yeah, it's cool to be okay with spokes council failures because spokes council failures are important, but they're also incredibly spectacular, and if people just come to spokes council who haven't yet participated in the movement and they see this sort of very out of control, yelling conversation about racism and marginalization and how the process marginalizes people, that might frighten people away from the movement. So even though OWS has this wishy-washy thing about, oh, anybody can join, there are actually these very intense circumstances that might frighten some people away. I mean, I think there are many more seasoned activists on this panel and in this room than I, but I think one of the first things that I would say is that I think that activism requires tenacity. So if you come and you're kind of unsure and the first thing you do is show up at spokes council and it's horrifying, which it is for many people, although I said that I actually am really enjoying these spokes councils and I think they're important and I'm going to stick to that, then it's like, well, do you go to Liberty Park the next day and participate in a think tank discussion? That's a much different vibe, right? You're sitting around, usually with members of the general public. You're talking about something like, should we participate within the system or outside the system? You're hearing people who have all kinds of different viewpoints. It's something that you might actually feel a lot more comfortable in. Or you hear that there's this foreclosure action and then you participate in it. So yeah, there may be people who just show up at the spokes council and get scared away, but hopefully then they see some kind of media attention that they, that calls them and they come back. That would be my hope. It's obviously speculative. In terms of the fear of arrest and arrestability, I agree completely with what Brian in particular was saying about direct action. I have also participated in because of my privilege, largely, and we talk about this a lot in the movement, have participated in a lot of the direct actions where arrestability is a potential, and I haven't gotten arrested a single time. I'm proud of that. I don't think getting arrested is something to be proud of. I'm proud of not getting arrested. So I would really encourage people to come and to participate in direct action trainings where we talk about different levels of arrestability and why it is that certain people in positions of privilege like me, why it's easier for me to get arrested and how to kind of deal with that. There's actually a very strategic and wonderful direct action working group that runs these trainings, and they're really helpful. That's all.
Okay, so if you guys have any closing thoughts, just keep it short, and then again, we have no more food but paper. And so I put the to you, or are we good?
I was under the impression that was closing.
That was closing? Yeah? Okay, that was closing.